Every Christmas Eve, I had a habit of driving out to the countryside where the roads were quiet. The snow fell thick, and the world felt like it had slowed down. This particular year, I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, from the crowds, and just be alone with my thoughts under the heavy white sky. The town I chose was small, forgotten by most maps, tucked between rolling hills and dense forests. It was peaceful, perfect for the quiet Christmas I craved. The snow was already coming down as I left the city behind, thick flakes covering the windshield in seconds. The road narrowed quickly, turning into a barely cleared path that wound between leafless trees. I kept the heater on full blast, watching the orange glow of the dashboard light cut through the dark. The air was cold and smelled of frozen earth and pine. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the soft crunch of tires on the snowy ground. After about an hour, I reached the small village. It was nearly empty. A few houses sat close together, all decorated with the usual Christmas lights, but most were dark. No sounds of laughter or parties, just the occasional flicker of candlelight behind curtains. I parked near the edge of the village by an old church with frosted windows. My plan was simple: spend the night in the back of my car, bundled up with a blanket, watching the snowfall outside. I stepped out, the cold hitting my face immediately. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward a small bench near the churchyard. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and the world felt isolated in a way that was both calming and strange. The street lamps cast long, soft pools of light, but they barely touched the shadows gathering at the edges of the village. I settled into the driver's seat and cracked the window just enough to let fresh air in, despite the cold. The car's interior smelled faintly of pine air freshener mixed with the cold metal and leather. I wrapped myself in the blanket, staring out at the falling snow, watching how it piled on the ground in thick, muffling layers. Hours passed, and the wind outside began to pick up, rattling the thin window glass. The silence was so complete it almost pressed on my ears. Occasionally, a distant branch would snap, or the wind would push snow against the car in sudden gusts. I thought about the town and the people who lived there. What were they doing tonight? Were they as alone as I was, or did they have family around, warmth, food, and company? Then, without warning, the car radio clicked on. No static, no music, just a low, steady hum. It was faint at first, almost easy to ignore, but then a voice came through, clear, calm, and steady. It wasn't a song or a broadcast. It was a list of numbers and street names, repeated over and over. The voice sounded mechanical, like a recorded message meant for some emergency system. My heart sped up. I twisted the dial to turn it off, but the radio wouldn't respond. The volume stayed low, but the message kept repeating, the cold voice naming streets I recognized from the village map. I tried the engine, thinking maybe a reset would help. The car cut off completely. The heater died. The radio went silent. The sudden cold inside the car was shocking, like a wave of ice. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees, rattling the car like it wanted to shake me loose. I stared at the frosted window, watching my breath fog it up in quick bursts. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. The screen showed no bars. Panic pressed in. I was stuck in this frozen village, in the dead of night, with no way to call for help and no one around for miles. Then I noticed something else. Outside, footprints had appeared in the snow, circling the car. They weren't fresh, but they hadn't been there before. The snow was falling steadily, so the prints had to be very recent. The circle was tight, just wide enough to walk around the car. The tracks were human-sized, but too straight, too even. Someone had been pacing around me. I wanted to believe it was a hunter or a traveler, but a deeper feeling told me otherwise. I felt watched, like eyes were peering from the dark woods at the edges of the village. My breath quickened again. The idea of leaving the car to check the footprints crossed my mind but felt impossible. The cold, the isolation, and the growing dread pinned me in place. Suddenly, a faint noise came from the churchyard, the soft sound of something dragging through snow. It was slow, heavy, methodical. I held my breath, straining to hear over the wind. The dragging got closer, then stopped just beyond the street lamp's glow. My eyes locked on the shadows by the trees, but nothing moved. The sound had stopped. Then, out of nowhere, the village lights went out. The whole village went completely dark, as if someone had flipped a giant switch. No Christmas lights, no street lamps, no windows glowing, just pure, empty blackness. The snow stopped falling too. It was as if the world itself held its breath. The silence after the lights went out was the worst part. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was empty and heavy, filled with the promise of something wrong. I sat frozen in the car, waiting for the lights to come back or the snow to start again, but nothing changed. After what felt like hours, the first light broke over the horizon. The village slowly came back to life with the soft blue dawn. The snow resumed falling gently, covering the footprints and the dragging marks. The radio in my car suddenly blinked back on with a normal Christmas music station playing. I stepped out carefully, feeling the cold bite at my face. The village looked normal again, as if nothing had happened. The footprints were gone, erased by the fresh snow. I walked toward the church and the nearest house, heart still pounding. Doors and windows were closed tight. No one was around. I got back into my car and started the engine. The heater worked again. The radio played music. I didn't stop to look back as I drove away, the village shrinking behind me in the morning light. Later, I learned that the village had lost power for a few hours that night because of a snowstorm knocking down lines. No one was outside during that time, and there were no reports of anyone near the village. The strange radio message I heard? Officials said it must have been a malfunction in the emergency system nearby. But I know what I felt and saw. The cold silence, the footsteps, the dragging sound, the total darkness. It wasn't just a power outage. Something about that night was off. The village seemed to hold its breath in a way I couldn't explain. When I look back now, every Christmas I think about that night. About being alone in the cold, trapped by silence and shadow. It wasn't ghosts or magic, just the kind of real fear that comes from being completely isolated, cut off and not knowing if someone or something is out there watching. That Christmas taught me how quiet the world can be when everything we rely on suddenly disappears, and how terrifying it is to be truly alone. Christmas was supposed to be the safest time of the year. Lights, warmth, family, and laughter filled every house on my street. But that year, it felt different. Cold in a way that wasn't just the weather outside. I still remember every single detail because it taught me a lesson I will never forget. Started a few days before Christmas. The snow was thick, covering the streets in a soft white blanket, muffling the usual sounds of the neighborhood. The sky was gray and heavy, the kind of gray that makes everything feel darker, even in daylight. I was home alone because my parents had gone out of town to visit relatives, and I decided to stay behind. I wanted some peace and quiet, away from the usual holiday chaos. I didn't expect peace, not the kind I got. The house felt too quiet, almost empty, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making every small noise sound sharp. I spent my days decorating the living room, putting up the tree, hanging ornaments, and stringing lights along the windows. I wrapped presents carefully and stacked them under the tree. Outside, the wind picked up now and then, rattling the old windows. I remember hearing the branches scrape against the glass, a dry, sharp sound that made me shiver. But I told myself it was just the wind and tried to focus on the Christmas songs playing softly on the radio. On Christmas Eve, the snow stopped falling, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. The street lights flickered on early, casting long shadows across the white ground. I was preparing dinner when I noticed something strange. The front door, which I was sure I locked, was slightly open. Just a crack, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. My heart jumped. I locked it again, double-checked all the windows, even the back door. Everything was secure. I shrugged it off, telling myself I must have forgotten to close it properly. Later that night, after dinner, I sat in the living room with the fire crackling softly in the fireplace. The warm glow from the tree lights mixed with the firelight made the room cozy. Outside, the wind was back, stronger now, howling against the house like it was trying to push its way in. I heard footsteps on the porch, light, careful, slow steps. My breath caught. I told myself it was probably the neighbor shoveling snow or checking their driveway. But then the footsteps stopped right outside the front door, and I felt frozen. The wind died down suddenly. That eerie silence returned. I didn't move. I waited, heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, but this time moving away, crunching softly on the snow. I watched from the window until the sound disappeared into the night. The next day, Christmas morning, I woke to a beautiful white world outside. The snow had piled higher, making everything look clean and fresh. I felt the usual excitement of Christmas morning, but it was mixed with a strange unease. When I went downstairs, I noticed the front door again. It was open wide this time, swinging slightly in the cold breeze. I locked it, looked around, and found no sign of forced entry. Nothing was stolen or broken, but the feeling stayed with me. I checked the locks again, taped the windows shut, even put some chairs against the doors. Still, every time I looked outside, I felt like someone was watching. The neighborhood was empty. No cars passed, no kids playing, just snow and silence. That evening, as night fell early, the power went out. The whole block was dark except for a few candles flickering behind windows. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the basement to get the emergency supplies. The basement door creaked loudly in the quiet house, and I noticed muddy footprints leading from the door toward the stairs. My stomach dropped. The footprints were fresh, heavy, and not mine. I followed the prints outside, but they disappeared into the snow near the back fence. Someone had been in my house while I was upstairs. But why? I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around me. I called the police, but the lines were dead, no signal, no connection. The storm had knocked everything out. That night, I stayed awake in the living room, flashlight in hand, listening for any sound. Every little noise made me jump. The wind scraping the roof, the floorboards creaking under the house settling, the distant howl of a dog. I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe it was just a thief looking for something valuable, but nothing had been taken. Around midnight, I heard something at the door. Slow, heavy knocks. Not the polite Christmas carolers I was hoping for, but deliberate and cold. I didn't open it. I stayed silent, hoping whoever was outside would leave. The knocking stopped, but footsteps circled the house. I could hear them step on the ice, crunch on the snow, move quickly then slowly. The next morning, the police finally arrived, responding to the neighbors who reported strange noises coming from my house. They found nothing inside except for the muddy footprints in the basement and some tracks around the property. There was no sign of who had been there or why. Nothing was stolen, and the doors and windows were intact but showed signs of being tested. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. The fear didn't come from any ghost or fairy tale creature, just from knowing someone was close enough to watch me, to wait, and to walk through my home in the middle of a silent, snowy Christmas. It was a reminder that danger doesn't always come in obvious forms. Sometimes it's the quiet, cold nights when you think you are safe that hide the real fear. That Christmas changed the way I saw safety and trust. I learned that even in the brightest, warmest times, shadows can linger. And sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that don't have clear endings. Only questions and the uneasy feeling that someone is still out there, watching. Christmas was supposed to be the safest time of the year. Lights, warmth, family, and laughter filled every house on my street. But that year, it felt different. Cold in a way that wasn't just the weather outside. I still remember every single detail because it taught me a lesson I will never forget. Started a few days before Christmas. The snow was thick, covering the streets in a soft white blanket, muffling the usual sounds of the neighborhood. The sky was gray and heavy, the kind of gray that makes everything feel darker, even in daylight. I was home alone because my parents had gone out of town to visit relatives, and I decided to stay behind. I wanted some peace and quiet, away from the usual holiday chaos. I didn't expect peace, not the kind I got. The house felt too quiet, almost empty, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making every small noise sound sharp. I spent my days decorating the living room, putting up the tree, hanging ornaments, and stringing lights along the windows. I wrapped presents carefully and stacked them under the tree. Outside, the wind picked up now and then, rattling the old windows. I remember hearing the branches scrape against the glass, a dry, sharp sound that made me shiver. But I told myself it was just the wind and tried to focus on the Christmas songs playing softly on the radio. On Christmas Eve, the snow stopped falling, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. The street lights flickered on early, casting long shadows across the white ground. I was preparing dinner when I noticed something strange. The front door, which I was sure I locked, was slightly open. Just a crack, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. My heart jumped. I locked it again, double-checked all the windows, even the back door. Everything was secure. I shrugged it off, telling myself I must have forgotten to close it properly. Later that night, after dinner, I sat in the living room with the fire crackling softly in the fireplace. The warm glow from the tree lights mixed with the firelight made the room cozy. Outside, the wind was back, stronger now, howling against the house like it was trying to push its way in. I heard footsteps on the porch, light, careful, slow steps. My breath caught. I told myself it was probably the neighbor shoveling snow or checking their driveway. But then the footsteps stopped right outside the front door, and I felt frozen. The wind died down suddenly. That eerie silence returned. I didn't move. I waited, heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, but this time moving away, crunching softly on the snow. I watched from the window until the sound disappeared into the night. The next day, Christmas morning, I woke to a beautiful white world outside. The snow had piled higher, making everything look clean and fresh. I felt the usual excitement of Christmas morning, but it was mixed with a strange unease. When I went downstairs, I noticed the front door again. It was open wide this time, swinging slightly in the cold breeze. I locked it, looked around, and found no sign of forced entry. Nothing was stolen or broken, but the feeling stayed with me. I checked the locks again, taped the windows shut, even put some chairs against the doors. Still, every time I looked outside, I felt like someone was watching. The neighborhood was empty. No cars passed, no kids playing, just snow and silence. That evening, as night fell early, the power went out. The whole block was dark except for a few candles flickering behind windows. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the basement to get the emergency supplies. The basement door creaked loudly in the quiet house, and I noticed muddy footprints leading from the door toward the stairs. My stomach dropped. The footprints were fresh, heavy, and not mine. I followed the prints outside, but they disappeared into the snow near the back fence. Someone had been in my house while I was upstairs. But why? I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around me. I called the police, but the lines were dead, no signal, no connection. The storm had knocked everything out. That night, I stayed awake in the living room, flashlight in hand, listening for any sound. Every little noise made me jump. The wind scraping the roof, the floorboards creaking under the house settling, the distant howl of a dog. I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe it was just a thief looking for something valuable, but nothing had been taken. Around midnight, I heard something at the door. Slow, heavy knocks. Not the polite Christmas carolers I was hoping for, but deliberate and cold. I didn't open it. I stayed silent, hoping whoever was outside would leave. The knocking stopped, but footsteps circled the house. I could hear them step on the ice, crunch on the snow, move quickly then slowly. The next morning, the police finally arrived, responding to the neighbors who reported strange noises coming from my house. They found nothing inside except for the muddy footprints in the basement and some tracks around the property. There was no sign of who had been there or why. Nothing was stolen, and the doors and windows were intact but showed signs of being tested. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. The fear didn't come from any ghost or fairy tale creature, just from knowing someone was close enough to watch me, to wait, and to walk through my home in the middle of a silent, snowy Christmas. It was a reminder that danger doesn't always come in obvious forms. Sometimes it's the quiet, cold nights when you think you are safe that hide the real fear. That Christmas changed the way I saw safety and trust. I learned that even in the brightest, warmest times, shadows can linger. And sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that don't have clear endings. Only questions and the uneasy feeling that someone is still out there, watching. The snow was falling heavy that Christmas Eve, thick and steady like a white curtain closing off the world. I had driven out to a small cabin my uncle owned, tucked deep in the woods a few miles from town. The roads were icy and barely plowed, but I wanted a quiet Christmas away from the noisy crowd and fake cheer of the city. The plan was simple. Get there, spend the night alone, maybe light a fire, drink some coffee, and enjoy the silence. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just a peaceful holiday to myself. The cabin looked like it hadn't been used in months. The windows were frosted over, the door stiff from the cold. I had to push hard to get it open, the wood creaking under the strain. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of old pine and cold wood. There was no heat, no electricity, just the dim light from my phone to guide me. I had packed a small gas heater and some wood for the fireplace, hoping to get it going quickly. Outside, the snow kept coming down, piling up on the roof and windows. I set the heater in the corner and started stacking logs in the fireplace. It took some effort to light the fire with damp wood, but finally, the flames caught, giving off a warm orange glow. The room brightened and the cold slowly gave way to heat. I took off my wet jacket and hung it near the fire to dry. The cabin was small but cozy, just one main room with a kitchen, a table, and a bed in the corner behind a curtain. The walls were wooden, lined with old hunting photos and tools, all dusty and forgotten. I sat down at the table with a cup of coffee and stared out the window. The trees were thick and dark, their branches heavy with snow, bending low. The wind howled outside, making the cabin shake a little. I felt oddly exposed, alone with the forest closing in on every side. But the quiet was soothing too, until I noticed something. A shape moving out there, just beyond the treeline. First, I thought it was a deer, maybe a stray dog. The snow made everything blurry, but the figure moved slow and steady, almost deliberate. I got up to the window and peered out, the cold glass fogging against my breath. The figure stood motionless now, just watching. It wasn't an animal. I could tell from the shape, too tall, too stiff. It wore a dark coat, maybe a hood pulled low over the face. I blinked and the figure was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree branch or a shadow. But something didn't sit right. The wind picked up and slammed against the cabin. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks flying. I tried to focus on the small comforts, the warmth, the coffee, the quiet, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window. Every time I looked, I thought I saw that figure again, sometimes closer, sometimes just out of sight. My heart started to race. I knew the woods could be dangerous, especially in the winter when animals wandered closer and people got lost. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen showed no signal. The cabin was too far from town, too deep in the woods. I was cut off. Panic crept in like a cold fog. I thought about packing up and leaving immediately, but the snow outside was thick and the roads slick. Driving back in the dark, and ice felt worse than staying put. Then the knocking started. At first, it was soft, almost like a tapping from a tree branch brushing the window. I froze. Then again, more deliberate, louder. Someone was outside. No footsteps in the snow, just the knock, 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 slow and steady. My hands trembled as I reached for the flashlight. I swept the beam over the window, but there was no one there, just snow and darkness. The knocking moved to the door. The old wood shook under the hits. My breath caught. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The back door was blocked by snowdrifts, and the front was the only exit. The knocking continued, now faster, urgent, demanding. I grabbed the hunting knife from the kitchen counter. A heavy, sharp blade my uncle kept for emergencies. I stood near the door, listening. Then silence. The cold pressed in around me again. Minutes passed like hours. I checked the windows. Nothing. No footprints in the snow. No sounds except the wind. It was as if whoever was out there vanished into thin air. Suddenly, I heard something else. A faint rustling from the woods. Branches snapping underfoot. Something was moving toward the cabin through the snow. I backed away from the door, heart pounding. The sound grew louder, more confident, until I could make out shapes in the snowstorm. Shadows creeping closer, like figures slipping between trees. I grabbed my phone again, hoping for a signal. Nothing. I tried calling 911, no service. The heater was running low, the fire dying down. I needed to act fast. I remembered the emergency flare gun in the drawer, a gift my uncle had left behind. It was meant for hunters lost in the woods, a last resort signal. I pulled it out and loaded a flare, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. If those people outside were dangerous, maybe the flare would scare them off or at least alert someone. I opened the door just a crack and fired the flare into the night. The sky lit up with a red streak, then a flare glowing bright like a small sun. The snow glimmered red, and the figures stopped. I heard startled shouts and running footsteps, then silence again. I locked the door quickly and slid the bolt home. My chest heaved. Minutes passed, but no one came back. The snowstorm swallowed all traces. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, watching every shadow. The fire in the fireplace was nearly out, the heater cold. When dawn finally broke, the woods looked peaceful, untouched. I stepped outside carefully and found no footprints, no signs of anyone nearby. It was like they had been ghosts, but I knew better. The police came later that morning, after the storm cleared and my calls finally got through. They searched the woods for hours but found no one. The knocking and rustling, they said it might have been people lost or trying to scare me off, but no evidence remained. I packed up the cabin and left that same day. Driving away, I kept looking back at the trees, still thick with snow and silence. That Christmas wasn't peaceful like I had hoped. It was a reminder that in the quietest, most isolated places, you can feel watched, hunted even, without any magic or ghosts. Just real people with dark intentions. And sometimes, the scariest thing about Christmas isn't a story or a shadow. It's knowing how close danger can get, even when you think you're safe, hidden behind walls and firelight in the middle of nowhere. That night stayed with me. Every knock, every step in the snow, clear as the flare's red light cutting through the dark. It was a warning I won't forget. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. The lights, the smell of pine, the quiet snow falling outside, all of it made me feel safe and warm. That year, I decided to spend Christmas alone in the cabin my family owned deep in the woods. It was an old place, far from town, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the world. I wanted a peaceful break from everything. No noise, no people, just the crackling fire and the soft fall of snow outside. I arrived in the late afternoon, carrying my bags through the snow-covered path. The air was cold and sharp, each breath visible as a little cloud. The cabin looked just as I remembered, wooden and worn, with a thin layer of snow on the roof and icicles hanging from the edges. Inside, the smell of old wood and pine filled the room. I unpacked slowly, making sure the firewood was stacked near the stove, and I lit the fire. The flames flickered and warmed the room quickly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I had brought food to last me a few days: canned soup, bread, some dried fruit, and a small bottle of whiskey to keep me company. I hung a few simple decorations around the cabin, a small string of lights and a sprig of holly I'd found near the path. It was modest, but it made the place feel a little more like Christmas. The quiet outside was perfect. No sounds except the occasional bird and the distant wind. That night, after a simple dinner, I sat by the fire reading a book, the only light coming from the flickering flames and the little Christmas lights I'd hung. The snow had started again, thick and steady, covering the windows and softening the world outside. As I sat there, I noticed something odd, a faint crunching sound outside, like footsteps in the snow. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a rabbit moving through the trees. But the footsteps were too heavy, too slow. They came closer, stopping just outside the cabin door. I could hear the faint scrape of something heavy against the snow. My heart quickened. I looked out the window, but the snow was falling too thick to see clearly. I waited, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell again. I told myself it was probably just the wind playing tricks with the snow, or a branch falling. I tried to ignore it and went to bed, locking the door behind me. The cabin was small, and I could hear every creak and groan of the old wood settling in the cold night. The snow kept falling, muffling all outside noise. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. A cold draft had slipped under the door. The footsteps were back, louder now, not just outside the door, but moving slowly around the cabin. I could hear heavy boots crunching through the snow, the scrape of metal against wood, and a faint breathing low and slow. The noise circled the cabin for a long time. I stayed still, frozen with fear, clutching the blanket. Eventually, the footsteps stopped again. I waited until dawn, my eyes fixed on the door. When the light finally came, I got up and looked outside. The snow had covered the ground in a thick, white blanket. Footprints circled the cabin, large and deep, far bigger than mine. They stopped abruptly at the door, then moved around the building in a slow loop, then disappeared into the forest. The footprints were not animal tracks. They were human, or at least they looked like them. But no one lived nearby, and the forest was known to be dangerous in winter. I knew I should call for help or leave immediately, but the storm outside was worse now, and I was trapped. Over the next day, I stayed inside, watching the snow and waiting for the storm to pass. The footprints did not return, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every crack of wood or snap of a branch sent a shiver down my spine. I found the courage to check the perimeter again, but no other signs of whoever had walked around the cabin were visible. Just the tracks I'd seen before, slowly disappearing under fresh snow. When the storm cleared late the next day, I packed my things quickly. I didn't wait for another night alone with the unknown outside. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and started the walk back to the main road. The snow was deep, and the cold bit at my face, but I kept moving without stopping. I didn't hear footsteps again, but the memory stayed with me. The sound of boots in the snow, the heavy breathing outside my door, the isolation of the cabin, the darkness, and the unknown presence lurking just beyond the windows made the whole Christmas feel like a trap. When I finally reached my car on the road, I sat inside for a long moment, letting the warmth fill me. I locked the doors and stared out at the forest. The tracks in the snow were gone, erased by the wind, but I knew what I had heard was real. Someone or something had been out there watching me the entire time. I never went back to that cabin for Christmas. The feeling of being alone, truly alone in the cold woods, with someone silently circling your shelter, is something that stays with you. That Christmas wasn't about joy or warmth for me. It was a reminder that even in the quietest places, fear can find you, and sometimes it waits just outside your door. The snow was falling thick and fast, covering everything in a heavy white blanket. It was Christmas Eve, and I was alone in my small cabin deep in the woods. The power had gone out hours ago, and the only light came from the flickering flames in the old stone fireplace. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like something angry, shaking the cabin and making the windows rattle. I had chosen this place to spend the holiday away from the noise and crowds, thinking I would find peace in the quiet winter forest. Instead, the silence felt heavy, almost alive with something unseen. I had brought enough firewood and supplies to last through the night, but the growing storm made me uneasy. The radio was dead, and my phone had lost signal as soon as the storm hit. No one could reach me, and I couldn't reach anyone. The only way in or out was the narrow dirt road, now buried under fresh snow and drifting in the wind. My mind kept drifting back to the strange noises I had heard earlier that evening. Scrapes and thuds coming from outside, far too close to be just animals. I told myself it was the wind pushing branches against the cabin, but the feeling didn't go away. I kept a flashlight nearby, and every now and then I would step outside onto the porch, shining its beam into the darkness. The snow was already deep, and the trees looked like silent giants standing guard. But among them, shadows seemed to move just beyond the light. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me, waiting. The cold bit through my jacket as I stared into the blackness, and I quickly retreated inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, more fragile. To calm my nerves, I sat close to the fire, warming my hands and staring at the glowing logs. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the thin window panes like a warning. I remembered the old stories about people getting lost in the woods on Christmas night, some never found again. I had dismissed them as silly, but now I wasn't so sure. The isolation, the storm, the strange sounds, they all mixed together into something I couldn't explain. As the hours passed, the storm worsened. The wind screamed and the snow piled higher, covering the steps and piling against the walls. My fire burned low, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang on the front door. I froze. It wasn't the wind this time. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the frosted window. Nothing was there. I opened the door slowly, expecting to see a branch or some fallen debris, but the porch was empty. The only sign of disturbance was a set of footprints leading away into the snow. They were too big to be mine, fresh and deep, heading toward the edge of the woods. My heart pounded as I stared into the night. Whoever or whatever had made those prints was out there now, somewhere in the storm. I closed the door and locked it tight, pulling the curtains over the windows. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a large deer or a stray dog, but something in me refused to believe it was harmless. Hours dragged on. The storm raged outside, and I stayed close to the fire, clutching a heavy metal poker for protection. Every creak and snap of the cabin set my nerves on edge. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like claws or nails dragging against wood or stone. It wasn't random. It was searching. I swallowed hard, trying to control my breathing so I wouldn't give away my fear. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, circling, staying close. I wanted to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm had cut me off completely. I thought about leaving, but the road was buried under snow, and I had no clear path. The nearest town was miles away, and with night settling in, travel was impossible. I was trapped with something unknown lurking just beyond the walls. I forced myself to stay awake, watching the fire as it shrank down to embers. The scraping stopped suddenly. Silence took over the night again, but it was different now, thick, heavy, waiting. I was so tense that I barely noticed the faint tapping on the window, soft but steady. Slowly, I turned my head toward it. The flashlight revealed nothing outside, just swirling snow and dark trees. But the tapping continued, steady, rhythmic. I felt frozen in place. The tapping was followed by a slow, scraping noise at the door again. Then something heavy hit the door once, twice, 3 times. Not a mistake. It was deliberate. I gripped the poker tighter, heart thudding in my chest, unsure if I was ready for what might come next. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. The silence returned, thicker than before. I sat there for a long time, eyes on the door, waiting for any sign of movement. The fire was almost out, and I realized I was exhausted. I couldn't keep fighting fear alone all night. Slowly, I laid down my guard and curled up near the last warm ashes. Morning came, pale and quiet, The storm had stopped. I stepped outside carefully, the cold air sharp in my lungs. The snow was deep, covering everything in white. I followed the footprints from the porch, which led only a short way into the woods before they disappeared. No signs of where the creature had gone. Then I saw something else. Scattered around the cabin, half buried in snow, were strange marks. Scratches on the wood, dents in the metal, and bits of torn fabric caught on branches. It was clear someone or something had been close enough to touch the cabin, to try to get in. But why? And what had stopped it? I realized the scratches weren't random. They were signs of desperation, maybe even fear. Whoever, or whatever, had come to my door had wanted something but had given up, or been scared off by the storm or my presence. The prints were huge, too big for a normal animal. I could only guess at what had been out there, waiting in the cold and snow. I packed up my things quickly and left the cabin behind, making my way down the now cleared road as best I could. When I reached the town, I told the sheriff what had happened. He listened carefully but said nothing could be done without proof. Maybe it was just a wild animal, he said, but I knew better. The woods held something real, something dangerous. That Christmas left a mark on me I couldn't shake. I had thought I was prepared for the solitude and cold, but I wasn't ready for the fear that came with being truly alone. Alone with something unknown just outside your door. I never went back to that cabin again. Every time winter came, I thought about that night, about the storm, the footprints, and the silence that screamed louder than anything else. Sometimes, I still wake up hearing that slow, scraping sound in the dark, wondering if it's coming back, or if I'm just haunted by the memory of what I couldn't explain. But whatever it was real, and it was waiting. Christmas had always been my favorite time of the year. The smell of pine trees, the cold air that bit at my cheeks, the way the streets glowed with lights. It all felt warm despite the freezing temperatures. That year, I decided to spend Christmas Eve alone, away from the noisy crowds and endless parties. I drove up to a small cabin I rented deep in the woods, hoping for peace and quiet. I wanted to disconnect from everything. Work, family drama, the stress of the season. The cabin was old but sturdy. It sat just off a narrow road, surrounded by thick pine trees covered in snow. The driveway was barely plowed, and as I pulled up, the crunch of the tires in the snow was the only sound. I carried in my bag a few groceries and a box of firewood. Inside, the air was cold and stale. I set to work stacking the wood in the fireplace, glad for the thought of a warm fire soon. The cabin was small but cozy. A rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, a couch with worn cushions, and a small kitchen area. I noticed a few old Christmas decorations left behind, some faded tinsel and a plastic wreath hanging crookedly on the wall. It felt strange but fitting, like the cabin itself remembered past holidays. I set a candle on the table and lit it. The small flame flickered against the dark window, casting long shadows across the room. I unpacked some canned soup, warmed it on the stove, and ate quietly. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the trees. The snow started falling harder, thick flakes covering the window like frosting. I pulled my chair closer to the fire and let myself relax. Hours passed. The fire crackled softly, and the silence was almost complete except for the storm outside. Then, just as I was about to settle in for the night, I heard something, a faint noise, like footsteps crunching in the snow, moving slowly near the cabin. My heart jumped. I reminded myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a fox, but the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, almost as if someone was pacing. I looked out the window. The snow hid most of the ground, but I could see dark shapes moving just beyond the trees. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and shined it toward the noise. The beam cut through the snowflakes, but I saw nothing. The footsteps continued, now closer to the door. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a lost traveler or maybe someone else staying nearby. But I knew no one else was supposed to be here. The nearest town was miles away, and the storm was fierce. Suddenly, A sharp knock echoed at the door. Not the friendly knock of someone visiting, but a slow, heavy thud. I froze. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, but there was no signal, no surprise out here in the middle of nowhere. The knocking stopped, then silence. I sat there, watching the door, waiting for another sound. After a few minutes, I thought maybe whoever it was had left. I told myself I'd check outside once the storm calmed. Then, another sound, softer this time, scraping like claws or nails dragging across the wooden wall beside the door. My breath hitched. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and moved toward the door, holding it like a weapon. I didn't want to open it, but I had to see what was outside. I threw open the door. The cold hit me like a wall. Snow whipped inside, swirling around my feet. The porch was empty, but the snow was marked by footprints. Heavy boots. Someone had been standing right there, just moments before. I scanned the woods, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I saw nothing but the endless dark of trees and snow. No signs of a person, no sound of retreating footsteps. I closed the door quickly and locked it. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst. I backed away, looking for a place to hide or call for help. But no signal, no way out. I sat back down near the fire, the poker still in my hand, watching every shadow. Time crawled. The storm outside was relentless, the snow piling against the windows like a wall. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the dying fire and my candle. The temperature dropped sharply, breath turning to mist in the air. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold on to warmth and calm. Then, from somewhere outside, a deep, slow breath sounded, like someone standing right on the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. The sound was so close it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stayed frozen, trying to listen. The breathing stopped, then silence again. No footsteps, no knocking, nothing. Hours passed like that. Every small noise made me jump. I kept checking the locks and windows. I thought about calling the police in the morning, but what would I say? Someone had been here, but vanished without a trace. At dawn, the storm finally died down. The sky was pale gray, and the snow had stopped falling. I opened the door again, stepping onto the porch to look for any sign of who or what had been there. The footprints were gone, covered by fresh snow. It was as if no one had been there at all. I packed up my things quickly. I didn't want to stay one more minute. The drive back was slow, the road still covered in ice. The whole way, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone behind me. When I finally got back to town, I called the sheriff. I explained what happened. They said they would check the area, but the cabin was on private property, and no one else reported anything suspicious. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there that night. No ghost, no monster, just a person, maybe someone watching, waiting, or lost. That Christmas, instead of feeling warm and peaceful, I felt a cold that stayed deep inside me, a fear I couldn't shake. Sometimes the scariest things aren't made of stories or legends. They're just real, plain, and close enough to touch. The winter air was sharp, cold enough to sting my cheeks and make my breath hang in the air like smoke. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, covering the town in a thick white blanket. It was Christmas Eve, and the streets were quiet, almost too quiet for the time of year. I had stayed late at work, finishing up some last-minute tasks, and now I was heading home through the empty streets, my boots crunching loudly in the snow. I decided to take a shortcut through a small park to save time. The park was usually lively during the day, with children playing and families walking dogs. But tonight it was deserted. The only light came from a few dim street lamps, their yellow glow barely reaching the ground. The trees stood bare and skeletal against the night sky, their branches scratching at the wind like claws. As I walked, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the snow, fresh and deep, leading off the path and into the darker part of the park. I paused, staring at them. They were too big to be a child's, but too close together to be an adult's running stride. The footprints looked like they belonged to someone who was walking fast, almost hurried. I felt a sudden chill creep down my spine. The park had no one in it at all, and the footprints stopped near a small frozen pond. There was no sign of anyone nearby, but the footprints continued around the edge of the pond and vanished into the thick bushes. My heart beat faster. I told myself it was nothing, maybe some late-night dog walker or a jogger, but a part of me felt uneasy. I quickened my pace, eager to get out of the park and back onto the main street where the houses were warm and bright with Christmas lights. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like a crunching noise, coming from the bushes near the pond. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze me in place. I held my breath, trying to listen. The wind was still, and the snow muffled most sounds, but the crunching came again, slow and deliberate. I looked around, trying to spot what could be making that noise. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw movement. Something large and dark was pushing through the bushes, just on the edge of the light from the street lamp. My mind raced. I remembered the news from earlier that week. A man had escaped from a nearby prison. They said he was dangerous, armed, and on the run. The police were searching everywhere, warning people to stay indoors. The thought hit me like a punch. Those footprints, the crunching in the bushes, maybe it was him. I turned and started running, my boots slipping on the ice beneath the snow. The cold air burned my lungs as I dashed toward the street. I could hear heavy breathing behind me, the sound of footsteps pounding on the frozen ground. I dared not look back. I pushed myself harder, slipping and sliding, barely managing to keep my balance. The houses on the street came into view, their windows glowing warmly with Christmas decorations. I knew if I could reach one of those houses, I could find help. Just as I was about to burst onto the main road, I stumbled over a hidden patch of ice and fell hard onto the snow. My hands scraped against the cold ground, and I heard the footsteps close behind me. Panicked, I scrambled to my feet and ran again, adrenaline drowning out the pain in my knees. I saw a small convenience store at the corner, still open despite the late hour. Its bright neon sign was a beacon in the dark. I pushed the door open and slammed it shut behind me. The bell above the door jingled sharply, and I took a deep breath, my chest heaving. The store was empty except for the clerk behind the counter. I looked out the window, but the street outside was empty now. No sign of anyone following me. The clerk gave me a concerned look but said nothing. I nodded to myself, trying to calm down. I was safe for the moment. I stayed inside until the police arrived, called by the clerk who had noticed my pale face and shaking hands. The officers took my statement and told me they were still searching the area. In the days that followed, the man was caught, a local story on the news. He had been hiding in the woods near the park, trying to avoid capture. That night, I realized how close I had come to danger. The Christmas lights, the peaceful snow, the quiet town. All of it had seemed so safe, so calm. But beneath the surface, something dark was lurking. Something that could have ended everything in an instant. I never took that shortcut through the park again. Even years later, every Christmas Eve, I think back to that night. The cold air, the crunch of footsteps in the snow, and the feeling of running for my life under the pale glow of the street lamps. It's a reminder that sometimes, the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They are real people, real threats, hidden just out of sight in the quiet moments we think we are safe. And on a cold Christmas night, when the world seems still and peaceful, danger can be closer than you think. The cold was sharper than usual that Christmas Eve. The snow lay thick on the ground, muffling the sounds of the world like a heavy blanket. I had driven out of town just after the last shopping rush, craving silence, away from the blinking lights and endless carols. The little cabin I rented sat at the edge of the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was supposed to be a quiet place to think, to rest, and maybe enjoy a calm Christmas by myself. Instead, what I found was far from peaceful. The road to the cabin was narrow and winding, bordered by tall pine trees that looked like dark soldiers standing still in the night. The sky was heavy with clouds, ready to dump more snow. I pulled the car into the small cleared space in front of the cabin, my boots crunching on the frozen ground as I grabbed my bags and locked the car. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of rough logs and a stone chimney. Smoke curled lazily from the top, suggesting someone had lit a fire recently. That was strange. I hadn't expected anyone else to be there. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of wood and dust. I started a fire in the old iron stove, its heat slowly pushing back the chill. The only light came from the small lamp on the table and the flickering flames. I unpacked my things, some clothes, food, and a stack of old Christmas movies I had brought for company. The quiet was thick, but it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air was holding its breath. Night fell fast. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window panes and making the trees groan. I sat close to the fire, my face glowing orange in the flickering light. Somewhere outside, the snow pressed against the cabin's walls like an invisible hand, silent and cold. The shadows danced on the walls, twisting and growing longer. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine, telling me something wasn't right. I told myself it was just the loneliness, the cold, the stories I'd heard about these woods. But the quiet was unnatural. It wasn't just silence, it was the absence of life. Around midnight, I noticed the batteries on my old radio had died. I hadn't thought to bring extras. That meant no news, no music, no contact with the outside world. I felt a small wave of panic. Alone, in the dark, with the storm closing in. Then I heard it. A faint noise from outside. Not the wind. Something softer, more careful. It was a scraping like nails or claws against the wood of the cabin. I froze, heart pounding, every muscle tight. The fire crackled and hissed, but outside, the sound came again. Slow, steady, deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, trying to see through the thick frost and snow. The beam of light cut through the dark, but all I could see was the edge of the clearing and the dark forest beyond. Nothing moved. The noise stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, or maybe a fox. But the noise had sounded too big, too heavy, to be a small animal. Still, I forced myself back to the fire, trying to calm down. The warmth slowly melted the chill from my fingers and toes. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and stared at the flames. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The old wiring must be failing. The power was out. I was plunged into darkness except for the fire and my flashlight. The noise came back, louder this time, scratching and scraping all around the cabin. It sounded like something trying to break in. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, my hands trembling. The wind howled outside, pushing snow against the walls like a living thing. The fire flickered, struggling to stay alive. I stayed near the door, listening. The noise stopped again, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. Minutes passed. Then, a loud crack. Something hit the roof. A heavy thud. I ran to the window and shone the flashlight upward, but all I saw was snow falling from the edge of the roof. Maybe a branch had broken under the weight. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was nothing. But then I saw it. Footprints in the snow, just outside the cabin door. Huge footprints. Not animal tracks, but heavy, human-sized boots. They circled the cabin slowly, as if whoever made them was watching me, waiting. The storm got worse. The snow fell harder, piling against the cabin walls. My phone had no signal, the radio was dead, and the power was out. I was trapped in the cold silence with whoever or whatever was outside. I spent the night sitting near the fire, knife in hand, watching the footprints grow and move with the snow. At times, I thought I heard voices, low murmurs just beyond the wall of snow, but the wind could have been playing tricks on me. Morning came slow and gray. When I finally stepped outside, the snow had stopped, but the footprints were clear. They led into the forest and never came back. I followed them as far as I dared, but they disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the white silence. I packed my things quickly and left, driving back to the nearest town without stopping. The town felt warm, safe, and noisy, a sharp contrast to the empty cold of the cabin. The people there didn't ask questions about the cabin or the footprints. I didn't volunteer any answers. What I realized is that sometimes the scariest things aren't stories or monsters from books. They're real people hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. That Christmas, I learned that the world can feel very small and very dangerous when you are completely alone, with nothing but silence and the weight of unseen eyes on you. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there that night, but they knew I was there. They knew I was alone. And that was enough to freeze my blood colder than the snow ever could. That Christmas taught me that fear isn't just about what you see. Sometimes it's about what you don't see, and knowing it's watching you. Every Christmas, my family would gather at our old cabin deep in the woods, a tradition we kept for as long as I could remember. This year was no different, but something felt off from the moment I stepped inside the creaky wooden door. The air was colder than usual, even with the fireplace roaring, and the silence pressed against my ears in a way I couldn't shake. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, where the snow piled high and the tall pine trees blocked out most of the weak winter sun. I had arrived early that afternoon, carrying my bags through the crunching snow and locking the heavy door behind me. I set down my things, already feeling the weight of loneliness in the empty space. Everyone else was still hours away, delayed by a snowstorm, but I decided to stay behind to get the fire going and prepare the place. The cabin's old wood floor creaked under my boots, and the windows were frosted over so thickly it was hard to see outside. I lit the fire with slow patience, listening to the wood crackle and the wind howl through the cracks in the walls. As the evening deepened, I began unpacking decorations. The little artificial tree I always put up was dusty from being stored in the attic, but I carefully set it on the small table near the window. I hung the worn red and gold baubles and the strands of twinkling lights, but the glow felt weak against the growing darkness outside. The snowstorm had thickened. The wind seemed louder, sometimes sounding like it was right outside the door, even when I was sure no one was there. That night, I lay in bed under a heavy quilt, the soft orange glow of the fire spilling through the hallway. My mind kept wandering to the noises I heard earlier, the odd knocks on the wooden walls, the soft rustling outside the window, and the occasional scraping sound against the side of the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a deer brushing against the trees. The forest was full of wildlife, and the old cabin was far from the road. Still, I felt uneasy, like someone or something was watching from the dark woods. Around midnight, the storm was at its worst. The howling wind sounded like it was shaking the entire building. I got out of bed to check the front door, worried it might have come loose. The hallway was dim, and the shadows from the fire danced wildly on the walls. I stepped to the door and looked outside, but the window was frosted and snow was piling up against it, making it impossible to see anything clearly. That's when I noticed the footprints in the snow. They led up to the porch, heavy, uneven prints that didn't look like animal tracks. They were too large and deep for any deer or wolf, and they stopped abruptly at the doorstep. There was no way anyone could have come all this way in the storm, not without me hearing them. The tracks were fresh, pressed deep into the snow, and they ended there. I checked the locks again. Everything was secure. My heart started pounding. I told myself it must be someone lost in the storm, maybe a traveler who had wandered off the road and found shelter here. I debated opening the door, but the cold wind pushed against it fiercely, and I hesitated. Instead, I went back to my room, locked the door, and kept the fire burning. Sleep came in fitful waves, disturbed by the sounds outside. Around 3 a.m., I was woken by a scraping noise at the window nearest my bed. I froze, listening hard. The sound was soft but steady, like someone dragging something sharp over the glass. I didn't dare look, but the feeling of eyes on me was unbearable. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to shut it all out. Morning came slowly, and the storm had finally died down. I stepped outside to see the damage. Snow covered everything in a thick white blanket, and the footprints were still there, now clearer in the daylight. They led up to the porch and then vanished. But what caught my eye was the mark on the window, long scratches, gouged deep into the wood and glass. Someone had been very close to me in the night. I called the police from the cabin phone, but the line was dead. The storm must have knocked it out. My phone had no signal either, and the nearest town was miles away. I was trapped here until the roads cleared. That day, I searched the perimeter of the cabin and found more footprints leading into the woods. They were large, the tread of heavy boots, but they stopped about 50 feet from the cabin and disappeared into the snowdrifts. No sign of a person, no trace of what they were doing out there. As the sun went down, I prepared for another cold night, this time more alert than before. I stacked firewood by the door and arranged heavy furniture in front of the windows, making it harder for anyone to see or get inside. I also kept a kitchen knife close by, the only weapon I had. Night fell again, and the silence of the forest pressed in even harder. This time, no scratching, no noises, just the cold, dark stillness. I wondered if whoever had left those tracks was gone or just waiting. In the early morning, when the sky was a pale gray, I heard a faint tapping at the back door. My heart nearly stopped. I crept to the door and looked through the cracked window. There was nothing there, just more snow, and the faint outline of footprints leading away from the cabin, fading into the trees. I didn't wait around to find out who had come. I packed what I could and started the slow, careful walk to the main road. The snow made every step heavy, and the cold bit into my face. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following, but the forest was empty. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the plowed highway. A passing car stopped when it saw me, and I got a ride to town. I told the police everything, about the footprints, the noises, the marks on the window, but they never found any evidence of anyone else at the cabin. When my family arrived the next day, the storm had passed and the woods seemed calm again. The cabin was quiet, normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with me. Someone who had watched me from the shadows, close enough to leave marks but far enough to remain unseen. I never went back to that cabin after that Christmas. I sold it the following year and refused to spend the holidays in the woods again. The memory stayed with me. The cold, the silence, and the proof that someone had been there, waiting just outside the fragile walls I called home. It was a reminder that sometimes, the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but the real people lurking in the dark, unseen but very much present. Christmas was supposed to be a time of joy, a time of warmth, lights, and family. But that year, for me, it turned into one of the most chilling experiences I have ever had, and not because of any ghost or fairy tale nonsense. It was real, raw, and terrifying, something that anyone could face if they were unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I live in a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone else. The streets were decorated with the usual bright lights and wreaths, and the smell of pine and cinnamon filled the cold air. I had just finished my shift at the local hardware store on Christmas Eve and was walking home alone. It was late, almost midnight, and the streets were quiet except for the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots. I always took the same route home, a shortcut through the park that saved me about 10 minutes. That night, the park was almost empty. A few benches dusted with snow sat under the skeletal branches of old trees, their shadows stretching like dark fingers in the dim streetlight. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, my breath steaming in the cold air. The quiet was comforting at first, but as I walked deeper into the park, it started to feel heavy and wrong. Something about the way the snow had fallen, it was too perfect, too undisturbed. No footprints except mine, no signs of animals or other people. It made the silence feel unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I kept my eyes on the path, trying to ignore the growing knot of fear in my stomach. About halfway through, I noticed something strange. There was a pile of discarded Christmas decorations near a bench, mostly broken lights and torn ribbons. It looked like someone had dumped them there and left in a hurry. I didn't think much of it until I saw fresh footprints leading away from the pile, heading toward the darker part of the park. The prints were too large to be mine, and they didn't match the pattern of any boot I recognized. A cold chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was probably just some late-night prank or someone cleaning up after a party. But then I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, crunching snow, far behind me. I stopped and listened. The sounds didn't match mine. They were slower, heavier. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to know if someone was really following me. My pace quickened. My heart hammered louder than the crunch of my boots. I tried to convince myself it was just someone else out walking, but every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. Suddenly, the path opened into a wide clearing with a frozen pond in the middle. The streetlights here flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on the ice. I could see my breath fogging in the cold air, my hands trembling as I reached into my pocket for my phone. No signal. The little screen stayed dark, dead. Panic started to claw at my chest. Behind me, the footsteps were closer now. The snow was disturbed in front and behind. I dared a quick glance back and saw a shadowy figure moving between the trees. I couldn't make out any features, just a bulky shape. The figure wasn't running but was definitely following. I started running. The snow made it hard to move fast, my boots slipping on the ice near the pond's edge. My breath came out in sharp bursts, my lungs burning from the cold and exertion. I didn't know where I was going, just away from the figure. Then, I tripped on a hidden root and fell hard onto the snow-covered ground. The cold bit into my skin through my clothes. The figure was closer now, its footsteps slow but deliberate. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the edge of the park where the houses started again. The familiar glow of windows and Christmas lights gave me a small sense of hope. Maybe someone would see me, help me, but the figure kept pace, always just behind. I reached the street and looked back one last time. The figure stopped at the tree line, watching me. I could see the shape of a man, tall and heavy, wearing a thick coat. His face was hidden by the shadows of his hood. I ran to the nearest house and banged on the door, breathless and shaking. The lights inside switched on, and a woman opened the door, startled to see me. Without waiting for an invitation, I stepped inside, slamming the door behind me. I told her about the figure in the park. She called the police right away. A few minutes later, officers arrived and searched the park. They found footprints and broken decorations, but no sign of the man. The police said he probably ran off when he saw the lights. They took my statement, asked questions about whether I knew anyone who might want to follow me. I said no. Felt surreal. I kept replaying the moments over and over. The cold, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. Later, I learned from neighbors that there had been a string of break-ins and robberies around Christmas in recent years. The man was likely a criminal using the holiday distraction to sneak through neighborhoods. The pile of broken decorations was probably a stash or a way to lure people into the park. He followed me because I was alone and late at night, an easy target. That Christmas, I didn't sleep much. I kept the lights on and stayed close to my family. I realized how dangerous the world can be, even during a time meant for joy. It wasn't a ghost or a fairy tale monster I had to fear. It was a real person with real intentions that could have turned deadly. The fear stayed with me for weeks, but I also learned to trust my instincts more. That night, I survived because I kept moving, because I noticed the small details, the footprints, the silence, the broken decorations. It was a harsh lesson about vigilance and caution. Christmas is supposed to be bright and warm, but that year it reminded me that sometimes darkness hides where you least expect it. And sometimes the scariest stories don't come from legends but from real life. From moments when everything feels normal and then suddenly, it's not. Christmas was supposed to be a time of joy, a time of warmth, lights, and family. But that year, for me, it turned into one of the most chilling experiences I have ever had, and not because of any ghost or fairy tale nonsense. It was real, raw, and terrifying, something that anyone could face if they were unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I live in a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone else. The streets were decorated with the usual bright lights and wreaths, and the smell of pine and cinnamon filled the cold air. I had just finished my shift at the local hardware store on Christmas Eve and was walking home alone. It was late, almost midnight, and the streets were quiet except for the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots. I always took the same route home, a shortcut through the park that saved me about 10 minutes. That night, the park was almost empty. A few benches dusted with snow sat under the skeletal branches of old trees, their shadows stretching like dark fingers in the dim streetlight. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, my breath steaming in the cold air. The quiet was comforting at first, but as I walked deeper into the park, it started to feel heavy and wrong. Something about the way the snow had fallen, it was too perfect, too undisturbed. No footprints except mine. No signs of animals or other people. It made the silence feel unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I kept my eyes on the path, trying to ignore the growing knot of fear in my stomach. About halfway through, I noticed something strange. There was a pile of discarded Christmas decorations near a bench, mostly broken lights and torn ribbons. It looked like someone had dumped them there and left in a hurry. I didn't think much of it until I saw fresh footprints leading away from the pile, heading toward the darker part of the park. The prints were too large to be mine, and they didn't match the pattern of any boot I recognized. A cold chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was probably just some late-night prank or someone cleaning up after a party. But then I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, crunching snow, far behind me. I stopped and listened. The sounds didn't match mine. They were slower, heavier. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to know if someone was really following me. My pace quickened. My heart hammered louder than the crunch of my boots. I tried to convince myself it was just someone else out walking, but every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. Suddenly, the path opened into a wide clearing with a frozen pond in the middle. The streetlights here flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on the ice. I could see my breath fogging in the cold air, my hands trembling as I reached into my pocket for my phone. No signal. The little screen stayed dark, dead. Panic started to claw at my chest. Behind me, the footsteps were closer now. The snow was disturbed in front and behind. I dared a quick glance back and saw a shadowy figure moving between the trees. I couldn't make out any features, just a bulky shape. The figure wasn't running but was definitely following. I started running. The snow made it hard to move fast, my boots slipping on the ice near the pond's edge. My breath came out in sharp bursts, my lungs burning from the cold and exertion. I didn't know where I was going, just away from the figure. Then, I tripped on a hidden root and fell hard onto the snow-covered ground. The cold bit into my skin through my clothes. The figure was closer now, its footsteps slow but deliberate. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the edge of the park where the houses started again. The familiar glow of windows and Christmas lights gave me a small sense of hope. Maybe someone would see me, help me, but the figure kept pace, always just behind. I reached the street and looked back one last time. The figure stopped at the tree line, watching me. I could see the shape of a man, tall and heavy, wearing a thick coat. His face was hidden by the shadows of his hood. I ran to the nearest house and banged on the door, breathless and shaking. The lights inside switched on, and a woman opened the door, startled to see me. Without waiting for an invitation, I stepped inside, slamming the door behind me. I told her about the figure in the park. She called the police right away. A few minutes later, officers arrived and searched the park. They found footprints and broken decorations, but no sign of the man. The police said he probably ran off when he saw the lights. They took my statement, asked questions about whether I knew anyone who might want to follow me. I said no. It felt surreal. I kept replaying the moments over and over. The cold, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. Later, I learned from neighbors that there had been a string of break-ins and robberies around Christmas in recent years. The man was likely a criminal using the holiday distraction to sneak through neighborhoods. The pile of broken decorations was probably a stash or a way to lure people into the park. He followed me because I was alone and late at night, an easy target. That Christmas, I didn't sleep much. I kept the lights on and stayed close to my family. I realized how dangerous the world can be, even during a time meant for joy. It wasn't a ghost or a fairy tale monster I had to fear. It was a real person with real intentions that could have turned deadly. The fear stayed with me for weeks, but I also learned to trust my instincts more. That night, I survived because I kept moving, because I noticed the small details, the footprints, the silence, the broken decorations. It was a harsh lesson about vigilance and caution. Christmas is supposed to be bright and warm, but that year it reminded me that sometimes darkness hides where you least expect it. And sometimes the scariest stories don't come from legends but from real life. From moments when everything feels normal and then suddenly, it's not. Every Christmas, I try to keep things simple. No big parties, no crowds, just me, the quiet cold, and the small house I live in on the edge of town. This past Christmas was supposed to be like any other. A little peace, a little rest, a bit of quiet time to myself. But it turned out to be something else entirely, something I won't forget anytime soon. Started a few days before Christmas. The weather was biting cold, snow falling thick and fast, covering everything in a heavy white blanket. I was preparing the house for the holiday, putting up the small tree I had bought at the local market, stringing up lights that barely worked, and hanging a few decorations on the walls. The house was old and creaky, with thin walls that seemed to suck in the cold air, but it was mine. It was quiet here, away from the busy streets, away from the noise. On Christmas Eve, I decided to go out for a walk in the nearby woods. The snow had just stopped, leaving everything silent except for the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bending low like they were trying to touch the earth. I thought the walk would calm me down, clear my head. The forest was close, and I had walked this path many times before. It was familiar, safe, or so I thought. As I walked deeper into the woods, the light from the town faded behind me. The sky was a dull gray, thick clouds hanging low. The cold was sharper here, biting through my coat. I kept walking, stepping over fallen branches and through thick snowdrifts. The silence was almost total, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. After a while, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow, fresh and deep. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. The prints led off the path, deeper into the forest where I rarely went. I felt a sudden chill that wasn't just from the cold air. Something about those tracks didn't feel right. They were too big, too heavy, like someone had been dragging something or moving fast. I thought about turning back, but curiosity pushed me forward. Following the tracks, I came to a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The snow here was disturbed, trampled as if a struggle had taken place. I could see broken branches scattered on the ground and patches of earth where the snow was stained dark and melted. It looked like someone had been hurt. My heart beat faster, and I scanned the area, but I saw no one. No signs of life except the footprints leading further into the trees. I debated whether to call for help, but my phone had no signal. I wasn't close enough to town, and the cold was pressing in. I decided to keep going, hoping I might find someone who could explain what was going on. The footprints led me to an old, forgotten cabin. It was half hidden by the snow and the thick branches, its roof sagging under the weight. The windows were dark and cracked, the door hanging slightly open on rusty hinges. I hesitated but pushed the door open with a slow creak. Inside, the cabin was a mess. The floor was covered in broken glass, torn fabric, and deep scratches marked the wooden walls. There was an eerie silence that made the hair on my neck stand up. I could smell something sharp and metallic in the air, blood. I found a chair overturned near the fireplace and what looked like dried blood on the floorboards. The place told a story of a fight, of someone trapped, maybe hurt badly. I moved further inside, careful not to step on the debris. In the corner, under a broken table, was a small bag with clothes inside, some torn, some dirty. I reached for it and found a small notebook. The pages were wet and smeared, but I could make out some writing. It was a desperate message, scribbled quickly, talking about being chased, hiding from someone dangerous. The cold was creeping in faster now, and I realized I had to leave. But just as I turned to go, I heard a faint noise, something dragging across the floor behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, listening. The noise stopped. I waited, heart pounding. Then the door slammed shut with a force that made the walls tremble. The small cabin plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, but no signal, no light. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I saw a shadow moving just outside the window, tall and still. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I pushed the door open with all my strength and ran back the way I came. The snow thick and heavy underfoot. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop until the edge of the woods was in sight, the lights of town glowing faintly through the trees. Once I was safe inside my house, I locked every door and window. I sat by the small fire I had built, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The notebook was still with me, its soaked pages a grim reminder that someone had been in real trouble. The next day, Christmas morning, I called the local sheriff. I gave them the address of the cabin and told them what I found. They promised to check it out. A few hours later, a sheriff showed up at my door. He told me that the cabin belonged to a man who had been missing for weeks. There was evidence of a struggle, but no signs of him. They found some blood and signs that someone else had been there recently. The investigation was ongoing. What scared me the most wasn't the empty cabin or the footprints in the snow. It was the realization that something real, something dangerous, had been out there in the cold, close enough for me to see and feel. No ghosts, no stories from fairy tales. Just the cold truth of a desperate person trapped. Someone who might still be out there, lost in the snow. That Christmas, I learned that the real horror isn't in monsters or spirits, but in the world we live in the shadows we don't see and the dangers we can't control. And sometimes, it's just a walk in the woods away from your warm, safe home. Every Christmas, I like to drive out of the city and find a quiet, snowy spot to clear my head. The lights, the noise, the crowded malls. It all gets too much. This year, I chose a small mountain town I'd never been to before. It was supposed to be peaceful and remote, the kind of place where you can hear nothing but the wind and crunch of snow under your boots. Perfect, I thought. I left my apartment early in the morning, packed my old SUV with blankets, food, and a few Christmas decorations I wanted to hang up for myself in the little cabin I rented. The roads were slick but clear, and the sky was bright with thick clouds promising fresh snow soon. The drive took longer than expected, twisting roads winding up steep hills through dense forests, the trees heavy with white frost. I kept my radio off, just the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of cold wind against the windows. When I finally reached the town, it was late afternoon. The main street was lined with small shops, all closed except for one tiny bakery emitting the warm smell of cinnamon and pine. The whole town felt asleep under the thick blanket of snow, no people in sight. The cabin was a few miles outside of town, down a narrow, unplowed road that had me gripping the steering wheel tight. The snow was coming down harder now, big flakes blurring the road ahead. I parked outside the cabin, a simple wooden structure with frost-covered windows and smoke curling from the chimney. I carried my bags inside and started a fire in the old stone fireplace. The cabin smelled like damp wood and cold air. I put on some warm clothes, hung my small string of Christmas lights around the window, and settled in. That night, the wind howled outside like a wild animal. The snow was thick against the windows, blocking out almost everything except the faint glow of my lights. I felt isolated but comforted at the same time, like I had my own little world away from everything. I ate canned stew from a pot and drank hot tea, the warmth from the fire growing steady. Around midnight, I was about to turn off the lights and go to bed when I heard a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it sounded like something scraping against the side of the cabin. It was low and slow, like nails dragging along wood. I froze, listening carefully. The scraping stopped, then started again, this time on the other side. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside, the snow cold and deep under my boots. The forest around the cabin was dark, the trees standing like silent sentinels. I shone the beam of the flashlight along the trunks and the thick underbrush, but saw nothing. No animal tracks in the snow, no sign of anyone. The sound was gone. Still, the feeling of being watched crept over me, that prickling sense that something was out there just beyond the edge of the light. I went back inside, locked the door, and checked all the windows. Every latch was secure. My heart was beating fast, but I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I forced myself to lie down and pulled the blankets tight over my head. The next morning, the snowstorm had passed, leaving a clear blue sky and fresh powder everywhere. I decided to explore the woods a bit, thinking the walk would clear my nerves. The snow was deep and soft, covering every branch and rock. The forest was silent except for the crunch of my boots. As I walked deeper, I noticed something strange. The snow near a group of trees wasn't smooth like the rest. There were marks, long scratches gouged into the bark, deep enough to see the pale wood beneath. The marks were fresh, and nearby the snow was disturbed like something had dragged across it. No footprints, just these marks. They looked violent, like something had struggled there. I kept moving, but the feeling of unease grew heavier. The sun was higher now, but the forest felt colder and darker. Shadows stretched long between the trees. Suddenly, I saw something up ahead. A figure crouched by a tree, hunched over. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I got closer, I saw it was a pile of torn clothes and something that looked like animal bones scattered around. A wave of nausea hit me. This was no animal feeding spot. The way the bones were arranged, the torn fabric, it looked like someone had been attacked here recently. I scanned the area, but found no footprints leading away, only the deep scratches on the trees nearby. My mind raced. What the hell had happened here? I knew I should turn back to the cabin, but my legs felt heavy. Then I noticed something else. Small bits of blood on the snow, smeared and partially covered by fresh flakes. The blood trail led toward the deeper woods, disappearing into a narrow path barely visible under the snow. I didn't want to follow it, but part of me couldn't stop. I felt a cold knot of fear mixed with curiosity tightening in my chest. I decided to head back quickly. Back at the cabin, I locked the doors again and sat by the fire, trying to calm down. The scratches, the blood, the torn clothes, it didn't make sense. No one lived near here and the town was empty. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal, no service at all. Hours passed and night came quickly. The wind picked up again, rattling the cabin walls. I stayed close to the fire, keeping my knife on the table just in case. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside, watching, waiting. Then I heard it again, the slow scraping noise on the cabin walls, this time louder and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door just enough to peer outside. The snow was falling thick and fast, but I saw nothing. No footprints, no shape, just the deep woods stretching endlessly. I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed what I could carry, wrapped in layers in my blankets, and started the SUV, fighting through the snow-covered road. The drive down was terrifying. The headlights barely cut through the storm. I kept catching glimpses of movement at the edge of the trees, shadows that disappeared when I looked straight. The road was slick, and at one point I nearly slid off the edge into a ravine. When I finally reached the town, I rushed to the only open store and told the clerk what I'd found. They looked pale and said the woods had been dangerous lately. People had gone missing in the past few weeks. No one knew what was causing it, but the local sheriff warned everyone to stay clear. I stayed in the town that night, never going back to the cabin. The next morning, I packed up and left, taking the highway straight back to the city. Looking back, I realized what terrified me the most wasn't some ghost or monster. It was the cold fact that something real and violent was out there, waiting in the woods. Something that could attack without warning and disappear without a trace. The silence, the scratches, the blood, they were proof. That Christmas, the season felt different. The bright lights and cheerful songs couldn't erase the memory of that dark forest, the weight of the snow, and the unknown terror lurking just beyond the glow of the fire. And I still don't know what it was that made those marks, or where the people who left those clothes went. But one thing is clear, Some places are best left alone, no matter how quiet or pretty they seem in the snow. The snow had started falling thick and steady the day before Christmas, blanketing the town in a soft white layer that muffled the usual sounds of cars and footsteps. I had decided to spend the holiday alone this year. After a rough breakup and a messy year, I just wanted quiet, peace, and a break from everything. My apartment was small, tucked on the third floor of an old brick building near the edge of town. The windows were drafty, and the heater rattled whenever I turned it up, but it was mine. That morning, the snow was still falling when I woke up. I pulled on my thick sweater and boots, then headed out to clear the sidewalk. The shovel scraped through the packed snow with some effort. The cold air bit at my cheeks, turning them pink. As I shoveled, I noticed something strange near the street. Footprints. Not the usual boot prints, but deeper, heavier ones. They looked like someone had been dragging something heavy through the snow. I stopped and stared, trying to make sense of it. The prints led off toward the small wooded area behind the parking lot. I shook my head and went back inside, brushing snow off my boots. The quiet felt heavy that day. I spent the afternoon inside, trying to focus on cooking a simple Christmas dinner. The wind outside howled, rattling the window panes, and the snow kept piling up. Then, about halfway through cooking, the power flickered and went out. The whole building was dark and cold in seconds. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and lit a candle to set on the kitchen table. I checked the breaker box. Everything looked normal. No way to call the power company either. My phone had lost signal somewhere during the storm. I figured I would just wait it out, maybe bundle up and try to sleep early. The silence outside was complete now. No cars, no people, nothing except the muffled sound of wind and the occasional crack of ice shifting on the street. The building felt older, colder. I sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, flashlight in hand, staring at the dark windows. Then, I heard it. A scraping sound coming from the alley behind the building. It was slow, heavy, like metal scraping against concrete. I froze, every muscle tense. The noise stopped, then started again, moving closer. My heart was pounding. I tried to tell myself it was probably some garbage cans being pushed by the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. It wasn't the wind. I got up slowly, flashlight in one hand, and moved toward the window to look out. The alley was barely visible in the dim light from the street lamps, which flickered weakly. At the far end of the alley, something was there, a large dark shape. I couldn't make out what it was. It didn't move much, just shifted slowly as if someone was dragging something large across the pavement. I stepped back, feeling a chill creep up my spine that wasn't from the cold. The scraping started again, louder this time. The sound was horrible, like nails on a chalkboard but worse, mixed with a wet, squelching noise underneath it. I swallowed hard, heart racing. I knew I should call someone, but with no phone signal and no power, I was completely cut off. Suddenly, the shape started moving toward the fire escape ladder. I watched as a figure slowly climbed down, dragging something heavy behind it. My mind raced with possibilities. A criminal? Someone hurt? But it was Christmas Eve. Who would be here doing something like this? The figure moved with odd stiffness, like it was struggling. Then it stopped just below my window and looked up. I saw the silhouette clearly, tall, bulky, wearing a heavy coat with a hood, face hidden in shadows. It was impossible to tell anything else. The figure crouched and pulled something under the fire escape out of view. I felt frozen, heart pounding louder than ever. Then, the figure stood up and started walking away, disappearing into the snow-covered street. I waited for a long time, making sure it was really gone. Then I grabbed my coat, decided I had to see what was under the fire escape. The snow was thick and deep, making every step difficult. I reached the alley, heart hammering with a mix of fear and curiosity. The area was cold and dark, and the smell hit me immediately, something metallic and sick. My flashlight beam landed on a large, bloody tarp. I swallowed hard and moved closer. The tarp was wet and heavy. I pulled at the corner, and underneath, I found a large, broken wooden crate. Inside was a frozen body, wrapped in plastic and tied with rope. I stumbled back, mouth dry, stomach churning. Someone was dead. This wasn't an accident or a random crime. It was deliberate. Someone had planned this, dragged the body here in the middle of a storm, and left it under the fire escape. My mind raced as I looked around, but the street was empty, silent except for the wind and snow. I had no idea who to call or what to do. My phone had no signal, the power was still out, and I was alone. I felt a cold, creeping fear settle over me, not just because of what I found, but because of what it meant. Someone dangerous was out there, and they were close. I covered the body back with the tarp and hurried to the building. Inside, I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to steady my shaking hands. I realized I needed to get help, but how? I wrapped myself in blankets, pulled the curtains closed, and waited for the storm to pass, hoping someone would check on me soon. Morning came with a gray, heavy sky and the snow still falling. I called the police as soon as I had signal again. They arrived quickly after that, but the feeling of dread didn't leave me. The officers asked questions, took pictures, and cordoned off the alley. The investigation revealed the body was someone reported missing weeks ago, murdered by someone close to them. The killer had tried to hide the evidence in the storm, thinking the snow and cold would keep it secret. I never found out exactly why I was the one who saw it first. Maybe it was luck or bad luck. That Christmas was the darkest I ever spent, not because of ghosts or magic, but because of real human darkness, violence and secrets hiding just beneath the surface of a quiet town. The snow finally melted weeks later, but I never forgot that night. Every Christmas after, the silence and cold reminded me of the sound of that dragging, the shadow beneath my window, and how close danger can be, even on a day meant for peace. I learned that some horrors aren't stories or legends. They're real, and sometimes they come right to your doorstep. Christmas had always been a time for warmth and family for me. The bright lights on the trees, the smell of pine mixed with cinnamon, and the quiet calm of snow falling outside made the season feel safe and magical. But that year, something went wrong in a way I never expected, something that turned everything upside down. It was Christmas Eve, and I was alone in my small house. Most years, I would have spent the night with family or friends, but this time things were different. My family had scattered, and my closest friend had to work late. So I decided to make the best of it. I decorated the living room with fairy lights and tinsel. I hung up my old stocking, filled it with small treats, and baked some cookies. The smell of sugar and butter filled the air as the oven hummed quietly in the background. Outside, the snow had started falling lightly, covering the street in a soft white blanket. I had just settled in with a cup of hot chocolate when I noticed something odd. The lights on my Christmas tree flickered a little. Not like a quick blink, but a slow, uneven flicker. I shrugged it off, thinking it might be the old wiring. The house was an old one, and the wiring had always been a little sketchy. Still, the lights usually worked fine. About an hour later, the flickering got worse. The lights would dim almost completely, then flash back on. I went to check the fuse box in the basement. The steps creaked under my feet as I descended into the cold, dark basement. The fuse box was old and rusty. When I opened it, I found a few fuses blown. I replaced them with new ones I had in a box nearby. For a moment, everything seemed fine. The lights on the tree glowed steady again. But then, the power cut out entirely. The entire house went dark except for the moonlight shining through the windows. I grabbed my phone to use its flashlight, but the battery was almost dead. I cursed myself for not charging it earlier. Outside, I heard the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees and the distant hum of cars on the street. I decided to check outside to see if the power outage was just in my house or if the whole block was affected. I wrapped myself in a thick coat and stepped out into the freezing cold. The street lights were off. The whole neighborhood was dark and silent, except for the sound of snow crunching under my boots. As I walked down the street, I noticed something strange on the power lines. Some wires were hanging low, close to the ground, swinging slightly in the wind. I realized there had been a storm earlier, and maybe the wind had knocked some lines down. This might explain the power outage. I wanted to go back inside and wait for the power company to fix it. But as I turned around, I saw a shadow moving quickly behind a row of parked cars. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or a stray animal. But the shape was too big and moved too deliberately to be a fox or a cat. My heart started beating faster, and I pulled my coat tighter around me. I walked faster toward my house, not daring to look back. When I reached the door, I fumbled with my keys because my fingers were numb from the cold. Finally, I got inside and locked the door behind me. I could still hear faint footsteps outside, slow and careful, as if someone was trying not to make noise. I moved to the window and peeked out through the curtain. The street was empty again. No shadows, no movement. I tried to calm myself. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe the shadow was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked my phone again. No signal, no battery. I was completely cut off. I lit some candles I had around the house to have some light. The soft flicker made the room feel warmer, but also threw large, moving shadows on the walls. I sat near the fireplace, wrapping myself in a blanket. The fire crackled and popped, casting an orange glow. Then I heard a noise at the back door. A slow, soft scratching sound, like something was trying to get in. My breath caught. I stared at the door, frozen. The scratching grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like nails dragging against wood. I told myself it must be an animal trapped outside, maybe a stray dog or a raccoon, but the sound was too heavy, too deliberate. I grabbed the nearest heavy object I could find, a metal flashlight, and slowly moved toward the door. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure anyone outside could hear it. I took a deep breath and yanked open the door. No one was there, just a thin layer of snow on the porch, untouched except for a set of muddy footprints leading away into the darkness. I looked down at the footprints, confused and scared. They were large, way bigger than mine, and they were wet, fresh. I closed the door quickly and locked it. I looked around the house to make sure all windows were locked and blinds closed. Everything seemed fine, but then I heard it again, a soft tapping at the window this time. I jumped and moved to the window. The tapping stopped. Outside, the snow was still falling quietly. No footprints this time. I sat back down by the fire, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I stayed up the rest of the night, wrapped in blankets with the fire burning low. I listened closely, every noise making me jump. The power was still out. The house was cold, and the wind outside howled softly through the trees. When morning finally came, I stepped outside cautiously. The snow covered everything, hiding any signs of the previous night's strange events. The street was empty and calm, the power still out in the neighborhood. I called the power company from a neighbor's house a few blocks away. They told me there had been a major storm, and some power lines were down. Crews were working to fix it, but it might take a while. As I walked back home, I noticed the muddy footprints again. They led to the edge of the woods behind my house, then disappeared. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees. I realized someone had been outside my house all night. Someone had come close enough to scratch at the door and tap the window trying to get in. But why? And where had they gone? I never found out who or what those footprints belonged to. The power came back the next day, and life slowly returned to normal. Still, every Christmas since then, when the wind is cold and the snow falls quietly, I think back to that night. I wonder if the shadow is still out there, waiting just beyond the trees, watching the lights flicker and the houses sleep. And I never leave my doors unlocked on Christmas Eve again. Christmas was supposed to be a time for warmth, light, and family. I thought that too as I set off on my drive to my parents' house. It was late afternoon on Christmas Eve, and the sky was already turning a dark shade of blue that made the falling snowflakes look almost black against it. The roads were slick, The kind of slick where the salt trucks hadn't yet made their rounds and the snow was fresh, soft, and dangerous. I had the usual festive music playing softly in the car, but the quiet hum was broken now and then by the sharp crack of ice breaking under my tires. The highway I took cuts through a long stretch of forest, mostly pines and firs, all covered in a thick blanket of snow. This stretch had always felt a little lonely to me, but on Christmas Eve, I thought of it as peaceful, like the world was taking a break just like me. I drove carefully, but even at a slow speed, the car slid slightly once or twice, reminding me how careful I had to be. It was cold outside, but inside the car, the heater kept me warm. I looked out at the trees, seeing nothing but white and dark green shadows. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. I tried to restart it, but it wouldn't catch. The lights flickered a bit, and then everything went dark. I was alone on this snowy road with my car dead. The radio crackled once, then silence. I checked my phone, no signal. The battery was low too. I wasn't exactly panicking yet, but I knew I had to do something fast. Night was closing in, and the temperature was dropping quickly. I grabbed my coat from the back seat and stepped outside. The snow crunched under my boots. The wind hit me hard, blowing flakes into my face. I could see my breath in the cold air. I walked around the car, looking for any damage or signs of what might have caused the engine to stop. Nothing obvious, just the cold and the snow. I thought maybe the fuel line had frozen, or the battery was dead. But I had no tools, no way to fix it out here. I checked the horizon. The nearest sign of life was a small farmhouse way off in the distance, just visible between the trees. The house had faint lights on. I figured the best chance was to walk there and ask for help. The snow was deep, and the cold made it hard to move quickly. I wrapped my coat tighter and started toward the house, my footsteps the only sound in the heavy silence. As I walked, I realized how dark and still the woods had become. No animals, no sounds of traffic, nothing. It was the kind of silence that felt alive and watching. I kept looking at the farmhouse lights, telling myself it was just a few minutes away, but the snow slowed me down more than I expected. I finally reached the porch. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, but enough to let cold air out. I pushed it open fully, stepping inside. The house was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. The smell hit me right away, a mix of wood smoke, old food, and something else, something musty and off. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked in. The house was small but filled with old furniture covered in dust. Christmas decorations hung unevenly. A dried wreath, faded ribbons, and a small tree with broken lights. It looked like no one had lived here for years, but the lights were on. I moved through the room cautiously, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. Then I heard it. A faint tapping, like something knocking on wood, came from the kitchen. I moved toward it, careful, heart beating faster. The kitchen door was closed. I pushed it open slowly. There was no one there, just a small window with frost on it, and the faint tapping noise stopped. I looked around. On the counter, an old clock ticked loudly, its hands frozen at 11:59. I glanced at the window again. Outside, the snow was still falling, but I saw something strange. Footprints. Fresh footprints, leading away from the house into the woods. Curiosity mixed with caution, I followed them. The snow was soft, and the footprints were deep and uneven, like someone was struggling or running. The footprints led to a small shed behind the house. I opened the shed door, creaked loudly. Inside, there was a wood stove, some firewood, and piles of empty boxes. Then I saw it. A frozen figure, curled up on the ground, covered in frost. Not alive. I stepped closer, horror creeping in as I realized it was a man. He looked like he had been here a long time, his face pale and frozen, his clothes torn and wet. I checked for any signs of life, but there was none. This was someone who had been trapped here, maybe lost in the snow, and had tried to find shelter in this house. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't a fairy tale or a ghost story. This was real, and it was deadly. I went back inside the house and searched for a phone or anything to call for help. In an old drawer, I found a landline phone covered in dust. I lifted the receiver, dead. No dial tone. The house was completely cut off. I spent what felt like hours trying to get the car started, but the cold had done its damage. I wrapped myself in blankets I found in the house and waited for morning, hoping someone would come by the highway. At dawn, the snow stopped and the sky turned gray. I decided to hike back to the road, leaving the cold, dead man behind. I walked carefully, my mind racing. How had this man ended up here? Had someone left him? Had he been trying to escape from something? When I finally reached the road, a truck passed by and I flagged it down. The driver took one look at my frozen face and called emergency services. I told them everything, the broken car, the dead man, the isolated house. They said they would send a rescue team. As I waited, I realized how fragile life was, especially in this cold and dark. Christmas was supposed to be warm, but out here it could be cruel and unforgiving. The man in that shed was just one example of how quickly things could go wrong. And that silent house, with its broken decorations and frozen clock, felt like a warning. When the emergency team arrived, they searched the house and the woods around it. They confirmed the man had been missing for days, likely caught in a storm and freezing to death trying to find shelter. The old farmhouse was abandoned for years, and somehow his footprints had led him there, but no one had been around to help. I was driven to a nearby town to warm up and contact my family. My car was gone, left on the road to be towed. The experience stayed with me for a long time. How close I was to being in the same position, stranded and alone on a cold Christmas night. That Christmas, the story wasn't about presents or joy. It was about survival and the harsh truth that nature doesn't care about the holiday spirit. It was a sharp reminder that no matter how much we prepare, sometimes things can go terribly wrong, and the only thing we can do is keep moving, keep hoping, and never take warmth and safety for granted. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. The lights, the cold air, the smell of pine and cinnamon. It all brought a quiet joy that no other season matched. That year, I was determined to make it special. I had moved away from the city to a small, quiet town nestled in the mountains, hoping for a peaceful Christmas. I thought it would be a good way to reset after a tough year. But what I got was something I never expected. I arrived at the small cabin I had rented 2 days before Christmas. It was an old wooden place, weathered by time but cozy. Snow blanketed the ground, thick and soft, muffling every sound outside. I stacked firewood near the porch and hung some string lights around the window frames, trying to bring a bit of warmth and cheer. The air was crisp and cold, and my breath came out in little clouds as I worked. That night, I made a fire and settled in with some hot cocoa and a book. The silence was almost perfect, only broken by the crackling fire and the occasional wind brushing through the trees. It was exactly what I wanted. The quiet helped me feel calm, safe even. Outside, the snow fell gently, covering the world in white. But as the evening went on, I started to notice little things. Small sounds that didn't belong. At first, it was faint. Branches scraping against the side of the cabin, maybe a loose shutter banging in the wind. But then I heard something else, something heavier moving through the snow. It wasn't the soft steps of a deer or a fox. This was different. The footsteps were heavy, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. I tried to shake it off as my imagination. The wind plays tricks in the mountains, I told myself. But every time I glanced out the window, the snow was still falling, and no one was there. Yet the sounds persisted. I could hear the crunch of boots in the snow circling the cabin, moving just out of sight. It was like something was walking around the cabin, watching. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept the fire burning all night, afraid to turn out the light. I sat by the window, wrapped in a thick blanket, eyes darting to every shadow. The snow outside was deep, and it looked peaceful under the moonlight, but I knew something was there. By morning, the snow had stopped. The world was silent again. I convinced myself it was just someone passing through, maybe a hunter or a lost traveler, and I felt a little foolish for being scared. Still, I was cautious. I locked every door and window, checked the firewood pile for footprints, and saw that there were heavy prints all around the cabin. The prints looked like boots, but bigger, almost too large for a normal person. I decided to take a walk through the woods. The fresh snow made the forest look magical, untouched. But as I walked, I saw more prints, big and heavy, moving through the trees. They didn't look like any animal tracks I knew. I followed them a short distance until they ended abruptly at a steep hill. The tracks vanished, as if whoever or whatever had made them climbed the hill and disappeared into the woods beyond. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding. The sun was low now, casting long shadows through the trees. When I reached the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, pressed deep into the snow, were those heavy footprints again. They led up to the door and then stopped. No prints inside, no sign anyone had come in, but the prints were right there, like someone had been standing just outside. That night, I barely slept. The sounds started again. Slow footsteps circling the cabin. The scrape of something heavy moving through the snow. I didn't dare look outside. I sat with the fire roaring, clutching a kitchen knife for some kind of protection. I thought about leaving, but the roads were closed with snow, and my phone had no signal. I was trapped. The next morning, I found fresh footprints leading away from the cabin, heading into the woods. They were still big, heavier than any humans should be. I grabbed my coat and started following them, desperate to know who or what was out there. The tracks led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever been. The trees grew thicker, the snow deeper. After walking for what felt like hours, I stumbled upon something strange. In a small clearing was a large pile of logs, arranged in a rough circle. Around it, the snow was disturbed, as if someone had been camping there recently. Nearby, there were scraps of torn fabric and bits of old rope tangled in the branches. It looked like a makeshift shelter. I stayed just on the edge of the clearing and looked around. There were no footprints leading away from this place, only the large ones I had been following, and they stopped here. It was like whoever had been here had vanished. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I been watched by a person all along? Someone hiding in the woods, watching me? But why? What did they want? I felt exposed and small in the middle of that snowy silence. I turned to head back, my breath coming in short gasps, when I heard a sudden noise. Something crashing through the trees behind me. Panic surged through me. I ran as fast as I could through the deep snow, stumbling over roots and branches. The noise was right behind me, heavy steps pounding through the woods. I didn't look back. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs aching, until I finally burst through the trees and saw the cabin's roof shining under the gray sky. I didn't stop until I was inside, locked the door behind me, and collapsed onto the floor, shaking. That night was the worst. The footsteps never left. Whoever it was circled the cabin, stayed close, always there but never seen. I stayed up all night, watching the windows, ready to defend myself. Morning finally came. The snow had stopped, and the world outside looked peaceful again. I decided I had to leave before the person, or whatever, came back. I packed quickly and started walking toward the main road, hoping to find help. The cold bit at my face, and the snow made every step hard, but I didn't stop. Hours later, I reached the road, where a plow had cleared a path. A car passed by, and I flagged it down, shivering and breathless. I told the driver everything I had seen and heard. They didn't laugh or brush it off. They said they knew about the place, how sometimes, in these remote mountains, people lost or desperate could hide for days. Some were harmless, others dangerous. The driver offered to take me to the nearest town. Back in the warmth of civilization, I felt relief wash over me. I called the local sheriff, who said they would check the area. I never went back to that cabin. The Christmas I had hoped for became one I would never forget. Sometimes I wonder who was out there, a lost soul, a desperate person, or maybe someone with darker reasons. But what I know is this. In the quiet of the snow-covered woods, when the world seems calm and safe, there can be something watching, waiting. And that Christmas, I came face to face with it. Not a ghost or fairy tale, but something real and frightening. The kind of fear that stays with you long after the snow melts. The winter was biting cold that Christmas Eve, the kind that makes your breath hang in the air like thin smoke and settles deep into your bones. The snow was falling steady and thick, blanketing everything around in a soft white silence. I was alone in the small cabin I'd rented up in the mountains, far from the city's usual Christmas noise. I had planned this trip to get away from the usual chaos. The endless shopping, the crowded malls, the fake smiles. Just me, the snow, and a few days of peace. But that night, peace was the last thing on my mind. The cabin was old but sturdy, made of heavy logs with a stone chimney that I had to light every few hours to keep warm. Inside, it smelled like pine and old wood, with the faint hint of smoke from the fireplace. I had brought a small Christmas tree, just to keep a bit of the holiday spirit around me. I decorated it with some cheap ornaments I found in a store before leaving, and I set a few candles on the table. The glow was soft and warm, a sharp contrast to the harsh cold outside. I was lying on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the fire flicker when I heard it. The first sound that didn't belong. It was soft at first, just a faint scraping noise from outside the cabin. Maybe the wind pushing against the door, I thought, or a branch brushing the window. I tried to ignore it, but then it came again, louder, more deliberate. Scrape, 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 like someone dragging their foot along the snow right outside. I got up and moved to the window, my heart starting to pick up pace. The snow was still falling, but the scrape was clearer now. It was definitely footsteps, not the light, quick steps of a deer or any animal I knew. These were heavy, slow, dragging. I squinted into the dark, but all I could see was the thick white snow and the shadows of the trees lining the edge of the clearing. The door creaked behind me, and I nearly jumped. I wasn't expecting any visitors. My phone had no signal out here, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I checked the locks on the door, they were tight. Whoever was out there couldn't get in unless they had a key or broke the door down. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but the scrape noise continued, circling the cabin. Suddenly, the power went out. The whole cabin went dark except for the dim glow from the fireplace. I fumbled for my phone to use the flashlight, but still no signal. The cold started to seep in faster without the electric heater running. I wrapped myself tighter in the blanket and stayed by the window, watching for any sign of movement. The snow fell thicker, but the scrape was getting closer. Then I heard it, a low, steady thud against the door. Not a bang or a kick, but slow, heavy knocks. Someone was out there, right outside, and they weren't shouting or trying to call me, just knocking like they wanted to be let in. My mind raced. I had told no one I was here. There was no reason for anyone to come. No one in these woods this late in the evening. My thoughts scrambled through the possibilities. Maybe someone lost, maybe someone dangerous. I tried the door again, still locked tight. The knocking stopped. The scrape went quiet for a moment, and then came back, this time from the back window near the kitchen. I moved cautiously, trying to see through the frosted glass. There was nothing there, just snow and trees. But then a shadow shifted just for a second. Something big moving out there, just out of clear view. I grabbed the heaviest knife from the kitchen drawer, the kind used for cutting meat, but heavy enough to feel like a weapon. I checked all the windows, making sure they were locked too. The fear was thick, like the cold, making my hands shake. My breathing got louder in the silence of the cabin. I decided to try and make a fire outside, hoping the light and smoke might scare off whoever was lurking. I bundled up in my jacket and boots, took a flashlight, and stepped outside. The snow crunched underfoot, bright white under the moonlight. I gathered dry branches from a small pile I had made earlier and lit them carefully. The fire caught quickly, casting tall shadows on the snow. For a few minutes, everything was quiet. The scrape and knock sounds had stopped. But then, just as I was beginning to feel a little safer, I heard a loud crack in the woods, about 30 meters from the fire. Something heavy was moving through the trees. The snow muffled the sound, but the weight was clear. I stayed still, shining the flashlight in the direction of the noise. There was nothing at first, just dark trunks and white snow. Then I saw it. A large figure moving slowly between the trees. Not a person. Too big, too heavy. I thought maybe a bear, but bears usually avoid humans, especially with a fire burning. My heart was pounding. I started back toward the cabin, careful not to run or make noise. But then the figure stepped into the clearing, and I could see it clearly in the firelight. It was a man, old, dirty, wearing torn clothes and a heavy coat that looked like it had seen better days. His face was covered in frost, his eyes wide and wild. He was dragging a long piece of wood behind him, something sharp-looking stuck to the end. I froze. He looked desperate, like he had been wandering for days. Maybe he was lost, maybe he was dangerous. I held the knife tighter, my mind racing. He looked at the fire and then at me standing on the porch. I shouted, hoping to scare him away, but his eyes didn't move. Instead, he slowly started walking toward the cabin. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, feeling the cold settle around me like a heavy blanket. The knocking started again, slower this time. I knew I had to call for help, but there was no signal. I grabbed the emergency radio I had brought just in case, and turned it on. Static. No one was out there. No one would hear me until morning. The knocking got louder, more forceful, but no shouting or talking. Just steady thumps against the wood. The fire in the fireplace was dying out, and the cabin grew colder by the minute. I sat down against the door, knife in hand, waiting for whatever was coming next. Then, just before dawn, the knocking stopped. The scrape stopped. The cold was brutal, and the silence was heavier than before. I stayed where I was, shivering but alert, until the sun finally rose. When I looked outside, the snow was untouched except for one set of heavy footprints leading away from the cabin toward the woods. No sign of the man, no sign of anything else, just footprints disappearing into the thick trees. I packed up as fast as I could that morning, my hands still shaking. I left the cabin without looking back, heart pounding. On the way down the mountain, I saw a small clearing with a frozen pond and a broken sled lying by the trees. No footprints, no tracks, just the sled. It looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. When I finally got back to civilization, I told the local ranger what I'd seen. He looked serious and told me that sometimes people get lost in those woods in winter. Some don't make it out. The man I saw was probably someone like that, lost, desperate, maybe even close to freezing. The whole experience stuck with me. That Christmas wasn't filled with cheer or joy. It was filled with fear and the cold reality of survival. I learned that not all scary stories need ghosts or monsters. Sometimes the scariest thing is a real person lost and desperate, in the wrong place at the wrong time. And sometimes, the silence afterward is the loudest sound you'll ever hear. The cold bit into my skin as I stepped out into the gray December afternoon. The streets were empty, coated with a thin crust of ice that had formed overnight. Christmas lights blinked faintly on the houses nearby, but the usual cheer felt hollow this year. I was alone, carrying a heavy box of decorations to the old cabin my family had owned for decades, tucked away in the woods just outside town. The plan was to spend Christmas there, away from the noise and stress of the city, to find some quiet. The drive out had been slow, the icy roads making it hard to keep traction. When I finally reached the gravel path that led to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The gate was open, swinging slightly in the wind. That wasn't right. We always closed it and locked it up tight. The box in my hands felt heavier all of a sudden. As I walked up the path, I looked around carefully. The trees were bare, their branches scratching at the sky like long fingers. The ground was hard and frozen, crunching under my boots. I had been here plenty of times before, but today it felt different. There was a strange silence, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The cabin door was unlocked. That was the first real warning sign. We always made sure to lock up whenever we left, especially during winter when no one was around for miles. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cold, stale like it hadn't been warmed in days. Dust covered the wooden floorboards and the furniture was coated with a thin layer of grime. I set the box down on the kitchen table and started pulling out decorations, tinsel, lights, ornaments. The smell of pine from the small tree in the corner was faint but comforting. I decided to plug in the lights first to see if the power was still on. Nothing. The kitchen remained dark except for the pale light slipping through the grimy windows. I found a flashlight in the drawer and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing more signs that something was wrong. The couch was overturned, cushions ripped open. Broken glass littered the floor by the window. Whoever had been here had not just entered, they had made a mess. But nothing was stolen, or at least I couldn't tell yet. I moved cautiously through the rooms, shining the light on every corner. The bedroom door creaked as I pushed it open, and my heart skipped when I saw the bed. The blankets were tossed to one side, as if someone had slept there recently. The window was cracked open, letting in the cold air. I closed the window and checked the locks. They were damaged, forced open. The thought that someone had been here while we were away made my skin crawl. But why? There was nothing valuable in the cabin, just old furniture, some canned food, and a few family photos. I returned to the kitchen and grabbed my phone, hoping to call someone, but there was no signal. That was expected out here, but it didn't help. I thought about driving back to town, but the icy road and the fading daylight made that a risky choice. I decided to get the fire going in the old stove. I found some dry wood in the shed outside and brought it in. The cabin felt unbearably cold, and I could see my breath in the air. After a few attempts, the fire caught, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The warmth was a relief. As I settled by the fire, I noticed something strange on the floor near the door. A set of footprints pressed lightly into the frost that had formed on the wooden porch outside. They were fresh, deeper and larger than mine, but not from a boot or shoe I recognized. The prints led off into the woods, disappearing quickly into the trees. My mind raced. Someone had been here, maybe still was. I thought about the neighbors, but they lived miles away and didn't usually come by this late. The isolation of the place suddenly felt threatening. I sat there for a long time, eyes darting to the window. Every small sound, a branch snapping, a gust of wind, made me tense. I tried to tell myself it was just the forest settling, but I knew the truth. Someone had been watching the cabin, maybe even waiting. Around midnight, the power flickered back on. The lights buzzed overhead, and I could finally put the flashlight away. The sudden brightness felt unnatural after the long darkness, almost like a spotlight. I noticed the Christmas tree in the corner glowing faintly with old fairy lights. It should have been comforting, but instead, it reminded me how out of place everything felt. I tried to rest but couldn't. I kept hearing noises outside, the rustle of leaves, the crunch of footsteps on ice. Every time I looked out the window, there was nothing but the still trees and snow. The cabin felt like a trap, a small island of warmth surrounded by cold and danger. The next morning, I found more footprints around the cabin, some close enough that whoever made them had almost touched the walls. But no one was there, no sign of who or why. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, throwing the decorations back in the box. As I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a slap. The sun was rising, casting long shadows through the trees. I locked the door as best as I could and started walking back down the path toward my car. Halfway there, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing motionless in the distance, just beyond the edge of the trees. It didn't move or make a sound, just stared. I didn't stop. I kept walking, faster and faster until I reached the car. The engine roared to life, and I sped away without looking back. Later, when I told the local sheriff, he said the cabin had been broken into a few times over the years, but no arrests were ever made. He warned me to be careful this time of year. People sometimes use the woods to hide or escape problems, he said. The footprints, the signs of someone being there. Maybe it wasn't some supernatural horror, just a desperate person hiding out in the cold. What scared me most was the thought of how close that person had been, how easily they could have been inside while I was there, and how little I really knew about what goes on when the world seems quiet. The cabin is now empty, and I'm done with Christmas there. The feeling of safety I thought I'd find was gone. Sometimes, I still wonder who that figure was and why they chose this lonely place to wait in the cold, just out of sight. But one thing is clear: not all fears come with ghost stories or magic. Some are real and raw, and they live right here in the silence of winter. Christmas was supposed to be a time for joy and family, a break from the everyday. I never expected that one Christmas would turn into something I'd never forget. Not for the usual reasons, but because of how terrifying it became in the most real and cold way possible. No ghosts, no magic, no fantasy. Just a brutal, plain reality that stayed with me long after the holiday lights came down. I had decided to spend Christmas alone that year. My family lived far away, and with work piling up, I figured it would be easier and quieter just to stay in my small apartment. The city was coated in snow, streets lined with Christmas decorations, and the cold wind blowing sharply down the sidewalks. The sky was gray and heavy, and even though the holiday season was supposed to bring warmth, everything felt cold and distant. That morning, I went out to pick up some food and a few last-minute things for a simple Christmas dinner. The stores were packed, but the mood felt off. People moved quickly, faces tired or tense. Even in the middle of holiday cheer, the usual smiles seemed forced, as if everyone was carrying some weight. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the usual holiday stress. On my way back, the sky darkened fast. The snow, which had been light and easy, began to fall heavier, thick flakes blurring the streets and muffling sounds. Traffic slowed, and soon people were rushing to get inside. I quickened my pace, feeling the cold creep through my coat. Back inside, I started cooking, the small apartment filling with smells of roasted chicken and cinnamon. The lights on my tiny tree flickered softly. I felt a strange mix of loneliness and unease, but I told myself it was just the weather. Around evening, the power went out. At first, I thought it was just a quick glitch. I checked the fuse box, but everything looked normal. The whole block was dark. No streetlights, no cars moving. Nothing but the heavy silence outside and the cold pressing in through the windows. I found some candles and lit them, setting them around the room. The flickering light threw shadows on the walls, but it didn't feel cozy. The silence was too complete, and the snow outside had stopped falling but left a thick, white blanket over everything. Then, I noticed something else. My phone wasn't working. No signal, no calls, no messages. I tried restarting it, but nothing. It was as if the city had been cut off completely. I checked the windows. The streets were empty. No cars, no people. Usually, even on a snowy night, there'd be someone out, walking dogs, heading home, or just passing through. Tonight, nothing. Hours passed. The temperature inside dropped quickly. I wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to stay warm. I looked outside again and saw that the snow wasn't just on the ground. It was piling up, thick and heavy, blocking the roads. It was clear the city was stuck in a storm that wasn't letting up. The worst part was the silence. No sirens, no noise. No sign that help was coming or anyone was checking on the neighborhood. The blackout was total. As the night grew colder, I heard a distant, slow crunching sound outside, like footsteps on snow. At first, I thought it was a neighbor trying to get home, but the sound was uneven, irregular. Stopped, then moved again, closer this time. I stayed by the window, heart pounding. The street was empty except for the snow and dark shapes of parked cars buried under white. No one was there, or at least no one I could see. The sound vanished. I tried to convince myself it was just animals or the wind moving branches, but the feeling of being watched crept in. Later, I realized I had no way to contact anyone. No phone, no internet, and with the storm, no chance of getting out soon. The apartment's heater was electric, so with no power, it was just cold. I started to ration the food, eat slowly. I checked all the doors and windows, locking everything. It felt like the cold was pressing in on me from all sides, but worse was the silence and emptiness outside. The next day, I woke to a frozen apartment. The snow was piled higher at the windows, blocking most of the view. Still no power, no heat. I dressed in layers, moved around to keep warm. Outside, I could see footprints in the snow, some close to the building, but not many. No sign of cars or people trying to clear the roads. As the day went on, my thoughts grew darker. What if the blackout lasted for days? Weeks? What if help never came? Food was running low. The cold was unbearable. I heard the crunching sound again that night, closer, more deliberate. This time I saw a figure moving slowly near the edge of the streetlight's faint glow. It wasn't wearing anything like a coat, just dark clothes hunched over. It stopped and stared in my direction. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't notice me behind the curtains. But then the figure moved away slowly, disappearing into the snow and dark. It was the first time I felt truly scared. Not from anything supernatural, but from the real world outside my window turning strange and hostile. Over the next days, the snowstorm showed no sign of stopping. The power outage continued. The city felt abandoned. The stores were closed, no deliveries, no police or emergency crews. I started to think about what I could do if I had to leave. The streets were blocked. Walking outside meant risking freezing or getting lost in the white wilderness of snow and wind. On the fourth day, I finally heard the sound of an engine. A snowplow, breaking through the thick snow. Relief flooded me. I rushed to the window to see it clear a path down the street. After hours, I finally saw a few cars coming slowly, headlights piercing through the gray haze. People were outside again, wrapped up tight against the cold. The power came back late that evening, and the heat returned like a blessing. Christmas that year was nothing like usual. There were no festive dinners with family or loud celebrations, just a quiet survival against the cold and isolation. But through all of it, I learned something about real fear. Not the kind from stories or movies, but the fear of being alone, cut off and vulnerable when the world around you turns against you. That Christmas left me with a deep respect for normal days and the warmth of people around you. I still remember every detail. The silence, the cold, the feeling of being trapped in a city that suddenly felt like a ghost town, but without any ghosts. It was a Christmas that taught me the hardest lessons come not from fantasy but from the harsh, unforgiving reality. Christmas was supposed to be a time of peace and warmth, but that year it turned into something I could never forget. A kind of fear that had nothing to do with myths or ghosts. It was cold outside, and the snow was thick on the ground, muffling sounds and making the whole town look like a quiet white blanket had been thrown over it. The streets were empty, except for the faint glow of Christmas lights hanging from houses, flickering weakly in the wind. I had decided to spend Christmas Eve alone at my small family cabin, miles away from the city. The plan was simple. No crowds, no noise, just me, some food, and the crackling fire in the old stone fireplace. I had driven out that afternoon, the roads already slick with ice, the cold air biting through my coat as I unloaded my bags. Inside the cabin, the smell of old wood and a hint of pine filled the air, comforting but lonely. After I set down my bags, I went to start the fire. The matches were old but still worked, and soon the flames were dancing in the hearth, casting warm orange light across the worn furniture and holiday decorations I'd left from last year. I unpacked some canned food and hot cocoa, planning to eat, watch some old Christmas movies on the small TV, and then sleep early. As the evening deepened, the wind outside picked up, howling like a low growl through the trees. It made the cabin creak and groan. At first, it was just normal winter sounds, but after a while, I noticed something else. Soft, slow footsteps crunching through the snow outside. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, and I hadn't seen a car or person all day. The footsteps stopped just beyond the porch, and the silence returned. I told myself it was probably a neighbor or maybe a stray animal. I tried to focus on the movie, but the sound of footsteps kept coming back, always stopping right outside the window closest to the door. I didn't dare look out at first. Then I noticed something strange. The porch light, which I was sure I had turned off, was flickering on and off. My heart started to pound. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly stood up, moving toward the window. The beam of the flashlight stretched out into the night. The snow-covered yard was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone. The wind had erased anything that might have been left behind. But the footsteps kept coming back every few minutes, always stopping just outside. It was like someone was pacing, watching, waiting. I shut the curtains and tried to keep calm. Maybe I was just tired and hearing things. But then I heard it, a faint tapping on the door. Slow, steady, and deliberate. My breath caught. I was alone, miles from anyone, and it was late at night. No one was supposed to be here. I looked out through the peephole. Nothing, just the snow falling softly. I could see the ground beneath the porch light, which was still flickering. Then the tapping started again, louder this time. My fingers trembled as I grabbed the small kitchen knife I kept for emergencies. I moved to the door, heart hammering, and opened it just a crack. Nothing. No one there. Just the cold night air and the quiet snow. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. No footprints, no signs of a person hiding nearby. The wind had wiped the snow clean again. But I knew what I had heard. It wasn't the wind or an animal. Suddenly, I heard a low, wet sound from the side of the cabin, near the woods, like something dragging itself through the snow. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and headed toward the noise, determined to find out what was there. As I moved closer to the tree line, I saw something dark on the ground. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His clothes were torn and soaked with blood. He was breathing but barely, his face pale and frozen from the cold. I didn't know how long he had been there, but it must have been hours. I helped him inside as quickly as I could and laid him near the fire. The man was weak and shivering, barely able to speak. I called 911 on my cell, but the signal was weak, almost dead. I gave him some water and covered him with a blanket, trying to warm him up. He didn't say much, just pointed to the woods and made a shaking motion with his head. That's when I realized something terrible had happened. He was running from something or someone. The blood wasn't his own. It was smeared on his clothes from where he must have dragged himself through the snow. His eyes looked terrified, like he had seen something he couldn't explain. I stayed awake with him all night, watching the woods through the windows, waiting for whatever had chased him to come back. The wind died down around dawn, and the snow stopped falling. The man's breathing steadied, but he remained silent. In the morning, the signal on my phone was strong enough to call for help. The ambulance arrived within an hour. The man was taken to the hospital, and I told them everything I knew. Later, the police searched the woods and found signs of a violent struggle. Broken branches, bloodstains, and footprints leading away into the deeper forest. They never found the attacker, but neighbors reported strange vehicles driving slowly down the roads that night, looking for something or someone. That Christmas, what I thought would be a quiet, peaceful time turned into a reminder that fear doesn't need ghosts or legends to be real. Sometimes it hides in the cold dark outside, in the unknown footsteps, and the desperate fight to survive. The man survived, but he never fully recovered from that night. And I never went back to that cabin again. Instead, I spent every Christmas after that surrounded by people, lights, and noise. Anything to keep the darkness and silence away. Because sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what you imagine, but what actually walks beside you in the cold. It was Christmas Eve, the kind of cold night where the wind bites through layers of clothes and makes every breath feel sharp and thin. The town was quiet, snow falling steadily, covering everything in a thick white blanket. The streets were almost empty except for a few people rushing home with packages, their heads down against the wind. I was alone, walking back from the small grocery store, carrying a heavy bag filled with food for the holiday dinner I was preparing. The weight of the bag was nothing compared to the weight in my mind. I had decided to spend Christmas alone this year. No family, no friends, just me and the silence of my small apartment. It was the first time in years I didn't join anyone for the holidays, and I thought it would be peaceful. But the deeper I walked into the cold night, the heavier that peace felt. like it was just an empty space waiting to be filled with something I didn't want to face. The streets near my place were lined with old houses, most with their lights off and curtains drawn tight. Some had decorations, faded strings of colored lights, drooping wreaths, plastic Santas frozen mid-jump from porches. The sight usually brought a warmth to the chest during the holidays, but that night it just made everything seem colder, like a reminder of what was missing. As I turned down the last block, something caught my eye. There was a light flickering in the window of the house on the corner, the one that had been empty for months. I knew this because I had passed it every day on my way to work. The door was always shut tight, the mailbox stuffed with old letters, the lawn overgrown and wild. But now, a dim, yellow light spilled through the cracked curtains. Curiosity pushed me closer. The window was dirty and fogged with condensation, but I could just make out the shape of a tree inside. Not a Christmas tree, but a tall, thin tree covered in what looked like old, faded decorations. The sight was strange enough, but what caught me off guard was the faint sound of music. An old Christmas carol, played quietly on what must have been a radio. I felt an odd pull to the house. The night was cold, and I wasn't dressed for much more than a quick walk. But I hesitated outside the door for a moment, then reached out and knocked lightly. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I knew it was strange to approach a deserted house on Christmas Eve. Stranger still to feel like I was supposed to be there. But something about the scene, the tree, the music, the light, made me feel like I was missing something important. Like there was a story waiting to be told in that empty space. I tried the door handle. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of dust and wood. The light came from a small lamp sitting on a rickety table near the stairs. The floor creaked under my feet as I stepped in. The tree stood in the corner of the living room, decorated with brittle old ornaments, some cracked, some faded to dull colors. There were no presents under it, just a thin layer of dust. The music was louder now, coming from an old radio sitting on the shelf. It was playing a scratchy, slow version of Silent Night. I started walking around, noticing things that made the place feel frozen in time. On the walls hung yellowed photographs of a family. Smiling faces, children in old-fashioned clothes, and a man and woman standing close together. The frames were cracked, some pictures torn. It was clear no one had lived here for a long time. As I moved through the house, I found signs of sudden departure. Plates on the table still held dried food crumbs. A chair was tipped over, and near the kitchen, there was a small pile of mail scattered on the floor, unopened. It felt like the family had left in a hurry, like something had forced them out. I felt an unsettling coldness creep over me, deeper than the winter air outside. Something wasn't right here. I stepped toward the stairs, but a strange sound made me freeze. It was soft at first, a faint tapping like footsteps, but they weren't coming from the floor above. They were coming from the basement. The basement door was closed, old and wooden with peeling paint. I didn't want to go down there. I shouldn't, but I needed to understand. Slowly, I reached for the handle and pulled it open. The air in the basement was thick and damp. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could see shapes. Boxes, old furniture, and something else. A faint smell of something rotten hit me, making me cough. I moved closer to the far corner where the sound was coming from. There, I found a small broken window letting in the faint moonlight, and beneath it, a thin trail of dried blood smeared across the floor. My heart pounded as I followed the stain toward a pile of old clothes and blankets. Beneath the pile was a small space, like a hiding spot, where I found something chilling. A worn-out child's shoe, dusty and torn. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just an abandoned house. Something terrible had happened here. The sudden departure, the abandoned belongings, the blood. Something had gone wrong, and it had been covered up or forgotten. I left the basement quickly, my mind racing. I closed the door behind me and ran out of the house into the cold night. I didn't look back until I was safely across the street. The light in the window went out suddenly, plunging the house into darkness. I went home that night with the bag of groceries forgotten on the floor, feeling the weight of what I had found pressing down on me. The next day, I called the local police and reported what I had seen. They came to investigate, and the story started to come out. The house had belonged to a family who disappeared years ago. The child had been sick and hidden away in the basement, with no one to help. Neighbors had heard strange noises but said nothing. The family vanished without a trace until a tip led the police to find the remains buried nearby. It was a cold case, never solved, just a tragic story of neglect and silence. Christmas after that wasn't peaceful for me. The light and warmth I once associated with the season were replaced by a quiet sadness. But I also felt a strange relief, knowing I had done something to bring the truth to light. The house was finally cleaned up, the tree taken down, and the street felt a little less haunted by the past. That year, I didn't spend Christmas alone anymore. I joined a local group that helped families in need, those who might otherwise disappear unnoticed. It wasn't about presents or decorations. It was about making sure no one was left behind or forgotten. That's what Christmas became for me. A chance to find light in the darkest places, to face the cold and silence, and to make things right where I could. It wasn't a fairy tale and there were no ghosts, but it was real. And in the end, that was enough. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. The cold air, the soft blanket of snow covering the ground, and the way the world seemed quieter somehow, calmer. That year, I decided to spend Christmas alone, away from the noise of the city and the usual chaos of family gatherings. I drove out to a small cabin I had rented in the woods, a place I had found online, advertised as peaceful and private. The kind of place where you could disappear for a few days and forget everything else. The cabin was just far enough from the nearest town to feel isolated, but close enough that I could get supplies if I needed. It was small, made of dark wood, with a stone chimney and windows frosted over from the cold. Inside, it smelled like pine and old wood, and there was a fireplace waiting to be lit. I had brought firewood, canned food, some frozen meat, and a few basic things. No internet, no phone signal, just me, the snow, and the silence. The first night, I sat by the fire with a cup of hot coffee, watching the flames flicker. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and the snow fell heavier, piling up against the walls. I felt calm, maybe a little lonely, but calm. I knew no one would be coming here, and I liked it that way. The second day was bright and cold. The sky was a clear blue, and the snow glistened like diamonds. I went outside, wrapped in my thick coat and boots, and walked through the forest, feeling the crunch of snow beneath my feet. The trees were heavy with ice, their branches hanging low. I found a small frozen creek and watched the thin layer of ice ripple under the weak winter sun. It was beautiful, almost magical. But as the day went on, I noticed something strange. The forest felt too quiet. Usually, when you're in the woods, you hear birds, squirrels, the rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. But here it was dead silent. No chirps, no rustling, no signs of life. Just the sound of the wind and my own breathing. That night, as I settled back in the cabin, I heard something outside. A soft thud, like footsteps on the snow. I froze, listening. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, walking past the windows. I looked outside, but the darkness was thick, and the snow muted everything. No shapes, no figures, just the empty woods. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog, but the footsteps didn't sound like animal tracks. They were heavy, steady, and close to the cabin. My heart started to beat faster. I closed the curtains and locked the doors, making sure everything was secure. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls, but outside, the silence returned. The next morning, I found strange marks in the snow around the cabin. Not animal tracks, but footprints. Big, wide, and spaced evenly as if someone had walked around the cabin carefully. I stared at them, confused and uneasy. No one else was supposed to be out here. I spent the day inside, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The cold air seeped through the cracks in the windows, and the firewood was running low faster than I expected. I wrapped myself in blankets and stared at the door, waiting for something to happen. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer, circling the cabin slowly. I held my breath as the sound stopped right outside the front door. Then, a long scrape like a nail or a sharp object dragging along the wood. I wanted to shout, to call for help, but my voice caught in my throat. I was alone, deep in the woods with no one to hear me. After what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle tense, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I dared to look outside. The footprints were still there, fresh and clear. But now, there were more signs of something unnatural. The snow around the cabin was disturbed, like someone had been digging or clawing at the ground. Near the back door, the earth was torn up, and small scratches covered the wood. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, feeling panic rise in my chest. There was no way anyone could have broken in without me noticing, but the signs were undeniable. Someone or something had been here. I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, grabbing whatever I could carry. As I prepared to leave, I heard a low sound outside, almost a growl mixed with a cough. Came from the woods behind the cabin. I didn't stop to look. I ran to my car, my breath visible in the freezing air, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I got to the car, I saw the front hood was scratched deeply, the paint ripped off in jagged lines. The tires had marks around them, like something tried to stop me from leaving. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. The heater struggled to warm the cold inside the car as I pulled away from the cabin, my eyes scanning the tree line the entire time. The drive back to town was slow, the roads covered in ice and snow. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But the road behind was empty, silent. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, the feeling of dread began to ease. Back in town, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They came out to the cabin with me the next day. The police officer looked serious as he examined the place. He told me that the area had been known for strange animal attacks recently. Wolves or wild dogs had been spotted, acting unusually aggressive and bold, attacking cabins and even people. They told me to avoid the woods at night and to keep alert if I ever went back. They believed the creatures were desperate, maybe starving in the deep winter. I never returned to that cabin again. The Christmas I spent there left me with a lasting fear that sometimes nature itself can turn dark and dangerous without any ghosts or magic involved. Just real animals, desperate and wild, reminding me that the woods don't belong to us. And sometimes, when we think we are safe, we're not. The silence you feel in the forest can be the last thing you hear before something comes for you. That Christmas, I learned that the real horror isn't from stories or legends. It's the raw, cold reality of being alone, vulnerable, and hunted. The Christmas season always had a way of stirring something in me. The cold air biting at my face, the smell of pine from the trees lining the streets, the bright red and green decorations hanging everywhere. It all felt like the world was trying to cover up something darker beneath the glitter and cheer. That year, the feeling wasn't just a vague unease. It was a quiet warning that something was wrong. I had decided to spend Christmas Eve alone at my family's old cabin up in the woods. It was a place I hadn't been to in years, a small, creaky building surrounded by tall, bare trees. I wanted to get away from the noise, the crowds, and the fake happiness of the city. Just me, the cold air, and the quiet. I thought it would be peaceful. The cabin was even smaller than I remembered, with its peeling paint and cracked windows. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and the smell of old wood and dust filled the rooms. I brought in firewood, stacked it carefully by the fireplace, and lit a fire to chase away the cold. The flames cast strange shadows on the walls, flickering like they had a life of their own. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the branches scrape against the windows. The snow was falling steadily, covering everything in white, muffling sounds and making the forest seem endless and quiet. I stood at the window and watched the snowflakes drift down, feeling a strange mix of calm and unease. That night, the power went out. I wasn't surprised. The area was known for losing electricity during storms. I lit candles, placed them around the room, and sat close to the fire. The flickering flames made the shadows move, and the cold seemed to press in from outside. I could hear the wind and the creaking of the old cabin, each sound amplified in the silence. As I tried to settle in, I noticed something strange. There were footsteps outside. Soft, slow, deliberate steps crunching in the snow. They circled the cabin, stopping sometimes, then moving again. The steps were too heavy to be an animal and too quiet to be someone running. I stayed still, listening, but couldn't see anyone through the frosted windows. The footsteps kept going for a long time, circling and stopping, like someone was watching, waiting. I checked the locks on the doors. They were old and rusty but seemed to hold. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. After what felt like hours, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thick and heavy. I tried to tell myself it was probably just someone walking through the woods, maybe a hunter or someone lost. But that didn't explain the way the footsteps circled the cabin, never moving away. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound made me jump. The wind, the creaking wood, the distant calls of animals. All seemed louder and more threatening. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. My heart pounded and I kept checking the doors and windows. The next morning, the power was still out. The storm had left the roads covered in snow, making it impossible for anyone to reach the cabin easily. I decided to go outside and see if I could find tracks or anything that explained the footsteps. The snow around the cabin was disturbed, but not by normal footprints. The prints were uneven, heavy, and large, like someone wearing big boots, but the pattern was odd, almost dragging in places. It looked like whoever made them was moving slowly and carefully, maybe trying not to make too much noise. I followed the tracks into the woods, staying close to the cabin. The trees stood tall and bare, their branches coated in snow. The air was cold and sharp. As I walked, the forest grew quieter, the usual sounds of birds and animals missing. The tracks ended near a small clearing where I saw something that made my stomach turn. There, in the snow, were marks of a struggle. Scratches in the bark of a tree, broken branches, and patches of disturbed snow as if someone had fallen or been dragged. I found a small, torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It looked like part of a jacket. The worst part was the blood stains, bright red against the white snow. I hurried back to the cabin, feeling the cold bite deeper. I locked all the doors and windows again and sat down to think. Whoever had been outside wasn't just wandering. They had been hurt or fighting for something, and they were close to me. That afternoon, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were slower, closer. The snow outside the window was disturbed, and I could see clear boot prints leading to the back door. I grabbed the old hunting rifle I found in the cabin, loaded it, and sat by the door, waiting. Hours passed with no sign of movement. The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Then I heard it, a soft knock at the door. Not loud, just one cautious knock. I didn't move, my finger tight on the trigger. Another knock, softer this time. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing. I opened the door just a crack and saw a man standing there. His face was pale, covered in dirt and scratches. His clothes were torn and wet with snow. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't eaten or slept for days. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with tired eyes. I didn't trust him. Something about the way he moved was off, nervous and tense. I told him to come in, but kept the door open just enough to keep control. He collapsed inside and I helped him to the fire. As he warmed up, I noticed the fear in his eyes, the way he kept glancing outside, like he was waiting for something to come. He didn't explain much, only that he had been lost in the woods, running from someone or something. That night, we stayed awake, listening to the wind and waiting. The power finally came back just before dawn. When I looked outside, the snow was fresh, covering all the tracks and signs of struggle. The man was gone. I searched the cabin and the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of him. No tracks leading away, no footprints in the fresh snow. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I packed up my things and left the cabin that morning. On the way back, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the quiet winter woods. Later, I reported the torn jacket and bloodstains to the local ranger station. They told me they hadn't had any missing person reports matching the description. The whole story felt like a bad dream, but the marks on the tree and the bloodstains were real. What scared me most was knowing someone had been out there, close enough to knock on my door, lost and desperate, but disappeared without a trace before morning. The woods, the storm, and the long night seemed to hide more than just snow and cold. That Christmas wasn't peaceful at all. It was a reminder that even in the quietest, brightest moments, something dark can be waiting just outside the door, real, human, and terrifying in its silence. Christmas was supposed to be a time of joy, warmth, and family, but that year it became something I will never forget, for all the wrong reasons. It all started a few days before Christmas, when I decided to take a short trip to a remote cabin in the mountains. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city and spend the holidays alone, just me and the silence of the snow-covered woods. The cabin was old but sturdy, built decades ago by a family who had long since moved away. It sat near a frozen lake, surrounded by tall pine trees heavy with snow. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sky gray and cold, the wind sharp against my face. The air smelled crisp and clean, mixed with the faint scent of pine and smoke from nearby chimneys. I parked my car on the snowy driveway and grabbed my bags, already feeling the calmness of being far from people. Inside, the cabin was simple. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, and the furniture was plain but comfortable. There was a small kitchen, a bedroom with a thick quilt on the bed, and a narrow stairway leading to a loft. I spent the first evening unpacking, lighting a fire, and making a small dinner. Outside, the snow kept falling softly, blanketing the ground in white. The next day, Christmas Eve, I woke to a frozen world. The trees glittered with frost, and the lake was completely covered in ice. I wrapped myself in a heavy coat, boots crunching on the snow as I explored the area. The silence was almost too complete. No birds, no animals, just the soft sound of wind moving through the branches. I gathered some dry wood near the cabin, careful not to stray too far. As evening approached, I built another fire in the fireplace. The cabin felt cozy despite the cold outside. I found an old box in the corner filled with Christmas decorations left by the previous owners. A few strings of faded lights, some dusty ornaments, and a hand-carved wooden star. I hung the star above the fireplace, smiling a little at the quiet charm of it all. Then, I noticed something strange. The old wooden door that led to the back porch was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it earlier, but maybe the wind had pushed it open. I closed it tightly and checked the lock twice. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle. Later, as the night grew deeper, I sat near the fire reading an old book I had found on the shelf. Suddenly, I heard a noise, soft but clear. It sounded like footsteps crunching in the snow, coming from the back of the cabin. My heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone else here. The cabin was miles from the nearest house. I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself, but the footsteps didn't sound like deer or foxes. They were heavier, deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door carefully. The snow outside was untouched except for a single set of footprints leading away from the cabin into the dark woods. The tracks were big, too big to be mine. They disappeared after a short distance, swallowed by the fresh snowfall. I went back inside, locked every door and window, and sat near the fire. My mind was racing, but I tried to calm down. Maybe someone was just walking by, a hunter or a hiker, but why would they leave footprints and then vanish? The next day, Christmas morning, I woke early, hearing the wind still blowing hard outside. I looked out the window and saw the forest covered in thick snow, no signs of the footprints from before. I thought maybe I had imagined it all. I made coffee and sat by the fire, feeling more relaxed. But then I heard the noise again, this time louder, coming from the porch. It was a slow scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy on the wood. I froze and looked toward the door. My mind screamed to run, but my body stayed rooted. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, my hands shaking. Slowly, I approached the door and peeked through the window. There was nothing there. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. But then, I noticed something on the ground. A large branch had been broken off a tree and placed right at the doorstep. It wasn't a natural thing. Someone had put it there deliberately. Fear started to settle in. Whoever had been here was close, maybe watching. I stayed inside, checked the locks again, and pulled the curtains shut. The rest of the day passed without incident, though every sound made me jump. Outside, the snowstorm was getting worse. That night, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness except for the firelight and my small flashlight. I kept the knife close, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, this time on the porch, slow and heavy. Suddenly, a loud banging shook the door. Someone was trying to get in. Panic flooded my chest. I backed away, looking for a way to escape. The windows were too small and high to climb out. The door was my only way. The banging stopped, but I heard whispering outside. Not words I could understand, just low sounds that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my coat and backpack, ready to run if I could open the door. I waited until the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. The snowstorm outside masked the sounds, giving me a chance. I opened the door quickly, the cold air hitting me like a wall. I ran toward my car, the snow up to my knees. When I reached the car, I found the tires frozen solid. The storm had iced over everything. My phone had no signal. I was trapped. I spent the night in the car, shivering and scared. The storm raged on, and the thought of someone watching or trying to break in stayed with me. Morning finally came, and with daylight I tried the tires again. I managed to dig around and clear some snow. Slowly, I got the car started and drove away from that place as fast as I could. Later, when I told others about what happened, they said maybe it was some local who didn't like strangers. Maybe someone who didn't want anyone near their land. The footprints, the broken branch, the banging, all signs of someone territorial, dangerous but very real. That Christmas, instead of peace and joy, I got fear and uncertainty. The woods, the snow, and the silence all hid something that didn't want me there. I never went back to that cabin, and I always make sure to spend the holidays somewhere crowded, where the warmth isn't just from the fire, but from people around me. The memory of that Christmas stays with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or fairy tales, but real people and real danger hiding in the cold, waiting for the right moment. The winter air was cold and sharp that Christmas Eve, the kind of cold that seemed to bite through even the thickest coats. I was alone in my small cabin in the woods, miles away from any town or neighbor. The forest around me was silent except for the occasional crunch of snow under my boots as I had gone out earlier to gather firewood. The sky was overcast, heavy with dark clouds promising more snow before the night was over. The dim light from my fireplace flickered against the wooden walls, casting long, uneasy shadows. I wasn't the kind of person to spend Christmas surrounded by people. Usually, I found comfort in solitude, away from the noise and fake smiles of crowded gatherings. This year, after everything had gone wrong, losing my job, the breakup, and the endless pile of bills, I chose the woods for Christmas. I thought the silence would help me think, maybe find some peace. Instead, it only made me feel more alone. The cabin was small, just one room with a tiny kitchen and a bed pushed against the far wall. I had strung a few old Christmas lights around the window, their pale glow barely fighting the darkness outside. On the small table sat a half-finished cup of coffee, the steam long gone, and a worn book I hadn't touched all evening. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the cabin's wooden frame. I could hear the snow starting to fall, light at first but then heavier, muffling the forest sounds further. The night was deepening fast. Suddenly, something caught my attention. A faint, irregular sound from outside, something like a scraping noise, soft but deliberate. It was not the usual creak of the trees or the wind pushing against the cabin. It was closer, just beyond the small porch, and it repeated at odd intervals. I stayed still, listening, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. The woods were full of creatures, especially this time of year, but the noise didn't quite fit any of the normal sounds I was used to. I grabbed my flashlight and wrapped myself in a heavy coat, deciding to check outside. The snow had piled up quickly, and the ground was already a thick, white blanket. The porch steps were covered, but the scraping sound was still there, coming from the edge of the trees. Stepping carefully into the snow, I pointed the flashlight toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the frozen branches and patches of snow-covered ground. At first, I saw nothing, just the quiet forest, untouched and still. But then my light caught on something odd. Deep scratches on the side of the cabin near the porch. The marks were long, jagged, and fresh, as if something large had tried to claw or scrape at the wood. My heart jumped. The scratches didn't look like any animal tracks I had seen before, and the size was bigger than any bear or wolf paw. The scraping started again, this time from the trees on the other side of the cabin, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. It was slower, methodical. I turned to look in that direction, feeling the weight of cold sweat trickle down my back despite the freezing temperature. I didn't want to believe that something was out there, stalking me, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me, my hands trembling as I bolted the latch. I could still hear the faint scraping noises moving around the cabin's perimeter, mixed with the whisper of wind through the branches. I sat down close to the fire, my breath heavy, eyes glued to the dark window. Outside, the snow fell harder, covering the fresh scratches little by little. Time passed slowly, the night stretching endlessly. Then, the silence was shattered by a loud thud against the cabin door. It wasn't just a knock or a gust of wind. It was a heavy, powerful bang that rattled the entire cabin. I jumped up, heart racing, and grabbed a heavy metal poker from beside the fireplace. The banging came again, 3 times in quick succession, each hit making the cabin shake. I moved to the door, looking through the peephole but seeing nothing but swirling snow and darkness. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. The cabin was too small and isolated. No neighbors to call for help. No cell phone signal for miles. My only chance was to wait until morning or try to make a break for the road, if I could even find it in the whiteout. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started. The woods fell quiet once more, save for the snow falling softly. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the poker, listening for any sound. When dawn finally broke, the cold light revealed the full scene outside. The snow had covered much of the ground, but I could still see deep, heavy footprints leading away from the cabin into the trees. They were large, too large for any human. But there were no signs of claws or paws in the snow, just these massive boot-like prints, as if someone had worn oversized boots and walked slowly around the cabin. I followed the trail, heart pounding, the snow crunching under my feet. It led deeper into the forest, fading out after a few hundred yards. There was no sign of who or what had made them. No dropped tools, no broken branches besides the natural fallen trees. Back at the cabin, I found more scratches on the door frame where the banging had been, but nothing else. I spent the next few days checking the area, never finding another sign of the strange visitor. I reported the incident to the local ranger station once I was back in town, but they said nothing unusual had been reported in that area. I've thought a lot about that night since. There was no ghost, no monster from a fairy tale, just something real, something human enough to make those giant boot prints but strong and patient enough to circle my cabin in the middle of a storm and leave its mark without ever being seen. Could have been a desperate person lost in the woods, or something else entirely. Whatever it was, it reminded me how thin the line between safety and danger can be, especially when you're alone. That Christmas was the hardest I've ever faced, not because of loneliness or cold, but because of that lingering feeling of being watched, hunted maybe. I never found out exactly what it was, but I know now that some dangers don't need ghosts or magic to be terrifying. Sometimes the scariest thing is the unknown, real and close enough to touch, but just out of sight. And every Christmas since, when the wind howls outside and the snow falls heavy, I remember that night in the cabin and how close I came to something I'll never understand. That's a kind of fear that doesn't fade, no matter how many years pass or how far away you go. It stays with you, quiet and waiting. Christmas was supposed to be a time for joy and family, a break from the everyday. I never expected that one Christmas would turn into something I'd never forget. Not for the usual reasons, but because of how terrifying it became in the most real and cold way possible. No ghosts, no magic, no fantasy. Just a brutal, plain reality that stayed with me long after the holiday lights came down. I had decided to spend Christmas alone that year. My family lived far away, and with work piling up, I figured it would be easier and quieter just to stay in my small apartment. The city was coated in snow, streets lined with Christmas decorations, and the cold wind blowing sharply down the sidewalks. The sky was gray and heavy, and even though the holiday season was supposed to bring warmth, everything felt cold and distant. That morning, I went out to pick up some food and a few last-minute things for a simple Christmas dinner. The stores were packed, but the mood felt off. People moved quickly, faces tired or tense, even in the middle of holiday cheer. The usual smiles seemed forced, as if everyone was carrying some weight. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the usual holiday stress. On my way back, the sky darkened fast. The snow, which had been light and easy, began to fall heavier, thick flakes blurring the streets and muffling sounds. Traffic slowed, and soon people were rushing to get inside. I quickened my pace, feeling the cold creep through my coat. Back inside, I started cooking, the small apartment filling with smells of roasted chicken and cinnamon. The lights on my tiny tree flickered softly. I felt a strange mix of loneliness and unease, but I told myself it was just the weather. Around evening, the power went out. At first, I thought it was just a quick glitch. I checked the fuse box, but everything looked normal. The whole block was dark. No streetlights, no cars moving. Nothing but the heavy silence outside and the cold pressing in through the windows. I found some candles and lit them, setting them around the room. The flickering light threw shadows on the walls, but it didn't feel cozy. The silence was too complete, and the snow outside had stopped falling but left a thick, white blanket over everything. Then, I noticed something else. My phone wasn't working. No signal, no calls, no messages. I tried restarting it, but nothing. It was as if the city had been cut off completely. I checked the windows. The streets were empty. No cars, no people. Usually, even on a snowy night, there'd be someone out, walking dogs, heading home, or just passing through. Tonight, nothing. Hours passed. The temperature inside dropped quickly. I wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to stay warm. I looked outside again and saw that the snow wasn't just on the ground. It was piling up, thick and heavy, blocking the roads. It was clear the city was stuck in a storm that wasn't letting up. The worst part was the silence. No sirens, no noise. No sign that help was coming or anyone was checking on the neighborhood. The blackout was total. As the night grew colder, I heard a distant, slow crunching sound outside, like footsteps on snow. At first, I thought it was a neighbor trying to get home, but the sound was uneven, irregular. Stopped, then moved again, closer this time. I stayed by the window, heart pounding. The street was empty except for the snow and dark shapes of parked cars buried under white. No one was there, or at least no one I could see. The sound vanished. I tried to convince myself it was just animals or the wind moving branches, but the feeling of being watched crept in. Later, I realized I had no way to contact anyone. No phone, no internet, and with the storm, no chance of getting out soon. The apartment's heater was electric, so with no power, it was just cold. I started to ration the food, eat slowly. I checked all the doors and windows, locking everything. It felt like the cold was pressing in on me from all sides, but worse was the silence and emptiness outside. The next day, I woke to a frozen apartment. The snow was piled higher at the windows, blocking most of the view. Still no power, no heat. I dressed in layers, moved around to keep warm. Outside, I could see footprints in the snow, some close to the building, but not many. No sign of cars or people trying to clear the roads. As the day went on, my thoughts grew darker. What if the blackout lasted for days? Weeks? What if help never came? Food was running low. The cold was unbearable. I heard the crunching sound again that night, closer, more deliberate. This time I saw a figure moving slowly near the edge of the streetlight's faint glow. It wasn't wearing anything like a coat, just dark clothes hunched over. It stopped and stared in my direction. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't notice me behind the curtains. But then the figure moved away slowly, disappearing into the snow and dark. It was the first time I felt truly scared. Not from anything supernatural, but from the real world outside my window turning strange and hostile. Over the next days, the snowstorm showed no sign of stopping. The power outage continued. The city felt abandoned. The stores were closed, no deliveries, no police or emergency crews. I started to think about what I could do if I had to leave. The streets were blocked. Walking outside meant risking freezing or getting lost in the white wilderness of snow and wind. On the fourth day, I finally heard the sound of an engine. A snowplow, breaking through the thick snow. Relief flooded me. I rushed to the window to see it clear a path down the street. After hours, I finally saw a few cars coming slowly, headlights piercing through the gray haze. People were outside again, wrapped up tight against the cold. The power came back late that evening, and the heat returned like a blessing. Christmas that year was nothing like usual. There were no festive dinners with family or loud celebrations, just a quiet survival against the cold and isolation. But through all of it, I learned something about real fear. Not the kind from stories or movies, but the fear of being alone, cut off and vulnerable when the world around you turns against you. That Christmas left me with a deep respect for normal days and the warmth of people around you. I still remember every detail. The silence, the cold, the feeling of being trapped in a city that suddenly felt like a ghost town, but without any ghosts. It was a Christmas that taught me the hardest lessons come not from fantasy but from the harsh, unforgiving reality.